Welcome to Criminal Nights. Tonight, I'll take you into the shadows of true crime, where the endless stretch of American highways becomes a hunting ground for predators who prey on the vulnerable. The hum of 18-wheelers carries more than cargo sometimes. It carries death itself. Before we dive into the darkness that lurks in truck stops and rest areas, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching Criminal Nights from. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, tonight's journey will test your nerves. I've walked countless miles of asphalt, interviewed truckers whose eyes still hold the terror of what they've witnessed, and stood in the exact spots where evil chose to strike. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, it's a warning about the monsters who use America's highway system as their personal killing field. Case 1. The Highway. Hunter, picture this. It's 2:47 a.m. on Interstate 40, somewhere between Nashville and Memphis. The rain hammers against windshields like bullets, and the only lights for miles are the red tail lights of big rigs cutting through the darkness. I'm sitting in the passenger seat of a Peterbilt 379, listening to the steady rhythm of windshield wipers and the low rumble of a Caterpillar engine. My driver, a weathered man named Jake Morrison with 23 years on the road, suddenly grips the steering wheel tighter. His knuckles turn white in the dashboard's green glow. "You see that?" he whispers, nodding toward the right shoulder of the highway dot through the rain-streaked window. I make out the silhouette of a figure standing beside a broken-down sedan. It's a woman, her arms wrapped around herself, soaked to the bone. She waves frantically at passing trucks, desperate for help. "We're stopping," I tell Jake. He shakes his head slowly. "No, we ain't. Not anymore. Not after what happened to Tommy Kowalski." That name sent a chill down my spine. Tommy Kowalski was a 42-year-old independent trucker from Michigan who had made the same route. Jake and I were traveling for over 15 years. He was known among drivers as a good Samaritan, the kind of man who would stop for anyone in distress, who carried jumper cables and a toolbox, who believed in helping fellow travelers. On March 15, 2019, Tommy's rig was found idling on the shoulder of I-40, just 30 miles from where we sat. The driver's door hung open like a mouth frozen in a scream. Tommy's CB radio crackled with static, and his coffee a truck stop special with 2 sugars was still warm on the dashboard. Tommy Kowalski was never seen alive again. I had first heard about Tommy's disappearance from Detective Maria Santos of the Tennessee Highway Patrol. She'd been working truck-related crimes for 8 years, and she told me that Tommy's case was different from the typical highway robberies or accidents they usually handled. When we found his truck, Detective Santos explained, her voice heavy with the weight of unsolved mysteries, everything was wrong. The engine was running, the hazard lights were flashing, but there was no emergency. No flat tire, no mechanical failure, nothing that would require him to stop. The truck's GPS showed that Tommy had been making good time on his route from Detroit to Little Rock. His logbook was up to date. His cargo computer components bound for Arkansas was untouched, and his wallet still contained $347 in cash. But, in the driver's seat, investigators found something that made Detective Santos request immediate backup. Fresh blood on the headrest, and a woman's earring, a small silver hoop, lying on the floorboard. The security cameras at the last truck stop where Tommy had been seen showed him leaving at 11:43 p.m. alone. Whatever happened to him occurred somewhere in the 40-mile stretch between that truck stop and where his abandoned rig was discovered. I spent 3 days retracing Tommy's route, stopping at every rest area, every exit, every place where a trucker might pull over to help a stranded motorist. It was at the Crossroads Truck Plaza, mile marker 127th, that I found the first piece of the puzzle. Earl Hutchins, a night shift fuel attendant with arms covered in tattoos and eyes that had seen too much, remembered Tommy Kowalski clearly. "Nice guy," Earl told me, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Always polite, always tipped. But that last night, ... He paused, looking out at the dark highway. That last night, he asked me something strange. According to Earl, Tommy had approached him around 11:30 p.m., just before getting back on the road. Tommy had asked if there had been any reports of stranded motorists on the highway, specifically a woman with car trouble. I told him I hadn't heard nothing, Earl continued, but then he showed me this. Earl pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos until he found what he was looking for. It was a screenshot of a CB radio message that Tommy had shared with him that night. The message, broadcast on Channel 19, the trucker's channel, read, "Any drivers eastbound on I-40. Woman with car trouble at mile 142. Dark sedan. She's been out there for hours. Someone needs to help her." The message was timestamped at 11:15 p.m., and the sender was identified only as Highway Angel. Tommy was always the kind to help, Earl said, his voice dropping to a whisper, but I got a bad feeling about that message. Something wasn't right. I asked Earl why he felt that way. "Because," he said, "I've been working this truck stop for 6 years. I know every driver who uses Channel 19 regular, like, I never heard of no Highway Angel before." Detective Santos shared the CB radio logs with me, and what I found made my blood run cold. The Highway Angel had been broadcasting similar messages for over 8 months. Always about stranded women, always on lonely stretches of Highway V, always during late night hours. But here's what made it truly terrifying. Every single location mentioned in those broadcasts was within a 5-mile radius of where Tommy Kowalski's truck was found. "We think we're dealing with someone who uses the CB radio system to lure Good Samaritan truckers into traps," Detective Santos explained. "Someone who knows the trucker culture, knows that most of these drivers have a code about helping people in distress." The investigation revealed that Tommy wasn't the first trucker to disappear under similar circumstances. Over the past 2 years, 4 independent truckers had vanished along the same stretch of I-40, all between Memphis and Nashville, all during late-night hours, all after receiving or responding to CB radio calls about stranded motorists. Robert Big Bob Martinez, age 38, disappeared October 2017. Stephen Caldwell, age 45, disappeared February 2018. James Diesel Thompson, age 51, disappeared August 2018. Danny Ortega, age 29, disappeared December 2018. And now Tommy Kowalski. Each truck was found abandoned, but undamaged, with no signs of struggle inside the cab, but small personal items that didn't belong to the drivers: a lipstick, a hair tie, a woman's glove, items that suggested the presence of a female passenger just before each man vanished. Detective Santos and I developed a theory that chilled us both to the bone. The Highway Angel wasn't an angel at all, it was someone who used the CB radio to coordinate fake emergencies, luring helpful truckers to isolated locations where they would encounter what appeared to be a stranded woman. But what happened after the truckers stopped? How did 5 grown men, experienced drivers who were naturally cautious, simply vanish without a trace? The answer came from an unexpected source: a surveillance camera at a roadside way station that had malfunctioned on the night Tommy disappeared. The camera hadn't recorded anything, but it had a backup power system that logged its own operational status. According to the logs, the camera had detected movement in its field of view at 12:17 am, just 20 minutes before Tommy's truck was found abandoned. But something had interfered with the recording system at exactly that moment, suggesting that someone had deliberately disabled it. That tells us our suspect is organized, Detective Santos noted. They know where the cameras are, they know how to disable them, and they've planned these abductions carefully. But there was something else that bothered both of us. Why were the trucks left behind? If this was about robbery, why not take the valuable cargo? If it was about the trucks themselves, why abandon 18-wheelers worth hundreds of thousands of dollars? The answer was more sinister than either of us had imagined. If this story chills you so far, Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another night of true crime. Because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see every lonely highway forever. The break in the case came from an unlikely source. A retired truck driver named Clarence Road Dog Williams, who had been monitoring CB radio traffic as a hobby since he stopped driving 5 years earlier. Clarence had been recording CB conversations for months, trying to help solve trucker disappearances across the South. In his collection of recordings, Clarence had captured something that made Detective Santos call in the FBI, a conversation between Highway Angel and an unknown second party. Recorded just 2 days after Tommy Kowalski disappeared, the conversation was brief but revealing. Highway Angel, package delivered. Same location as the others. Unknown voice. Any complications? Highway Angel, none. He was eager to help, just like the others. Makes the job easier when they come willingly. Unknown voice, good. The client is pleased with the quality. When can you deliver the next one? Highway Angel, give me a week to let things cool down. Then I'll find another good Samaritan. The recording suggested that the disappeared truckers weren't random victims. They were being specifically targeted and delivered to someone for a specific purpose. But what purpose? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the case and developed a profile that made my stomach turn. They believed we were dealing with a human trafficking operation that specifically targeted truck drivers because they were often traveling alone. Their disappearances might not be immediately noticed, and their routes were predictable. But there was something even more disturbing. The truckers were likely being sold to someone who had a specific interest in drivers, possibly for forced labor in illegal operations, or worse, for purposes I don't want to imagine. Federal agents launched Operation Rolling Thunder, an undercover operation designed to catch the Highway Angel in the act. Undercover officers posed as truck drivers, monitoring CB channels and responding to fake emergency calls. For 3 months, nothing happened. The Highway Angel had gone silent, possibly aware that law enforcement was closing in. Then, on a foggy November night, an undercover agent calling himself Montana Mike received a CB message that matched the pattern. A woman with car trouble, stranded on a lonely stretch of highway, desperately needing help. Agent Mike, whose real name was Special Agent David Rodriguez, followed. The location given in the broadcast 2-mile marker 139 on I-40. There, just as described, was a dark sedan, with its hood up and hazard lights flashing. A woman in a white dress stood beside the car, waving frantically at approaching vehicles. Agent Rodriguez pulled his undercover rig to the shoulder and activated a hidden recording device. As he approached the woman, she appeared to be in genuine distress, crying, shivering, claiming her phone had no signal and she'd been stranded for hours. But something was wrong. Agent Rodriguez noticed that despite the woman's claims of being stranded for hours, her clothes were dry even though it had been raining. Her car's engine was warm, suggesting it had been driven recently, and most importantly, her car wasn't. Actually, disabled. The hood was up, but nothing was wrong with the engine. As Agent Rodriguez pretended to examine her car, the woman stepped closer to him. That's when he saw it, a small device in her hand, similar to a cattle prod. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and put your hands where I can see them," Agent Rodriguez said, revealing his weapon and badge. The woman's demeanor changed. Instantly, the fake distress vanished, replaced by cold calculation. Without a word, she dropped the device and bolted into the darkness beyond the highway. Agent Rodriguez called for backup, but by the time other units arrived, the woman had vanished into the Tennessee wilderness. However, they had her car, her weapon, and most importantly, evidence that would finally break the case open. Inside the abandoned sedan, investigators found a treasure trove of evidence: CB radios, fake license plates, detailed maps of highway camera locations, and most disturbing of all, a notebook containing profiles of over 30 truck drivers. The profiles included photographs, personal information, route patterns, and notes about each driver's personalities, specifically noting which drivers were most likely to stop and help strangers. Tommy Kowalski's profile was there, along with the 4 other missing truckers, but the notebook revealed something that made the investigation take on national importance. This wasn't just a regional operation. The profiles included drivers from across the country, suggesting a network that spanned multiple states and possibly involved dozens of perpetrators. The FBI's forensic analysis of the notebook revealed fingerprints that matched a woman named Sarah Kellerman, a 34-year-old former truck stop waitress with a history of minor fraud charges. More importantly, they found DNA evidence linking her to 3 of the abandoned trucks. When agents raided Kellerman's apartment in Nashville, they found it had been abandoned for weeks, but her computer revealed communications with at least 6 other individuals across 4 states, all using coded language that suggested they were coordinating similar operations. One email, sent just days before the failed attempt to abduct Agent Rodriguez, contained a message that still haunts everyone involved in the investigation. The harvest has been good this season. The clients are asking for more drivers, especially long haulers, with clean records. The southeastern route is getting too hot. Time to expand to the western territories. The most heartbreaking part of this investigation was what we learned about the fate of Tommy Kowalski and the other missing truckers. Through digital forensics and communication intercepts, federal agents were able to trace some of the network's activities to a human trafficking operation that extended into Mexico and Central America. The truckers, investigators believe, were being sold to illegal operations that needed experienced drivers for smuggling routes, people who could handle large vehicles and were familiar with highway systems, but who wouldn't be missed immediately due to their transient lifestyle. Some victims were likely forced to drive drug shipments across borders. Others may have been used for even more sinister purposes that I won't detail here, out of respect for their families. In December 2019, Mexican authorities raided a compound in Nuevo Laredo and rescued 13 kidnapping victims, including 2 American truck drivers. One of them was Stephen Caldwell, who had been missing for nearly 2 years. Stephen was alive, but the physical and psychological trauma of his captivity had left him unable to provide coherent information about his ordeal. Tommy Kowalski was not among the rescued victims, and his fate remains unknown. The investigation into Sarah Kellerman revealed that Highway Angel was more than just a criminal alias. It was the name of an entire network of people who used CB radios and fake emergencies to abduct truck drivers across the American highway system. Kellerman, according to FBI profilers, was likely a middleman in the operations, someone who identified and captured targets but wasn't the mastermind behind the network. Her background as a truck stop waitress had given her extensive knowledge of trucker culture and communication patterns, making her the perfect person to operate. CB radio lures. Phone records showed that Kellerman had been in contact with individuals in Texas, California, Arizona, and Florida, suggesting that the Highway Angel network operated across the entire southern United States. Even more disturbing, similar disappearances had been reported in Mexico, suggesting the network extended across international borders. But Sarah Kellerman vanished that night when she fled from Agent Rodriguez, and despite a nationwide manhunt, she has never been found. The FBI believes she's either delimited by her co-conspirators to prevent her from revealing information, or she's operating under a new identity in a different region. As I write this, Operation Rolling Thunder continues. The FBI has identified at least 12 other truckers who have disappeared under similar circumstances across the United States since 2015, and they suspect there may be dozens more cases that haven't been connected to the network. The CB radio, communications that once helped truckers stay safe on long, lonely highways, have been compromised by predators who understand exactly how to exploit the trucker community's culture of mutual assistance. Detective Santos, who has now been promoted to lead a multi-state task force investigating trucker abductions, told me that the Highway Angel case has fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases involving commercial drivers. We used to assume that when a trucker disappeared, it was probably an accident or a voluntary disappearance, she explained. Now we know that there are organized networks specifically targeting these drivers, and we treat every case as a potential abduction until proven otherwise. What terrifies me most about the Highway Angel case isn't just the sophistication of the operation, or the number of victims, or even the fact that the perpetrators are still operating somewhere out there. It's the realization that America's highway system, the arteries that connect our communities and carry our commerce, has been turned into a hunting ground by people who understand exactly how to exploit our better instincts. Every time a trucker stops to help a stranded motorist, they're taking a risk that goes far beyond the normal dangers of highway assistance. They're potentially walking into a trap set by people who have studied their behavior, mapped their routes, and learned how to use their compassion against them. The CB radio chatter that once represented the camaraderie and mutual support of the trucking community has been infiltrated by voices that broadcast lies designed to lure good people to their doom. As I rode through that rainy night with Jake Morrison, listening to the static-filled voices of drivers sharing information about road conditions and weather, I realized that some of those voices might belong to predators scanning for their next victim. Jake was right not to stop for the stranded woman we saw that night. In a world where highway angels hunt good Samaritans, paranoia has become a survival skill. But what kind of society have we created when helping a stranger becomes an act of potentially fatal courage? When the very highways that symbolize American freedom and mobility become corridors of fear. The Highway Angel network may have been disrupted, but it hasn't been destroyed. Somewhere out there, Sarah Kellerman, or people like her, are still monitoring CB channels, still setting traps, still turning our highways into hunting grounds. And somewhere out there, Tommy Kowalski and dozens of other drivers are either enduring unimaginable horrors or have already paid the ultimate price for the crime of being willing to help a stranger in need. The next time you're driving on a dark highway and you see someone who appears to be in distress, remember Tommy Kowalski, remember the Highway Angel, and remember that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes, evil wears the face of someone asking for help. The rain outside Jake's truck had stopped, but the darkness beyond our headlights seemed deeper than before. The CB radio crackled with the voices of drivers sharing information about rest stops and fuel prices, and I found myself listening carefully to each transmission, wondering if any of those voices belonged to someone hunting for their next victim. Tommy Kowalski's story isn't over, as long as the Highway Angel network operates. As long as predators use our highways as their hunting grounds, his disappearance remains a warning that echoes through every truck stop, every rest area, every lonely mile of American asphalt. The highway ahead stretched endlessly into the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, someone was listening to our conversation, learning our route, and perhaps already planning their next trap for an unsuspecting Good Samaritan. In the world of criminal nights, the monsters don't hide under beds or in closets. They hide behind CB radios, broadcasting fake emergencies into the darkness, waiting for heroes to answer their calls. Case 2, The Phantom. Fleet. The diesel engine's rumble beneath my feet feels different tonight, as I stand in the abandoned parking lot of what used to be Morrison's Truck Plaza in eastern Colorado. The wind carries the scent of sage and something else, something that makes my skin crawl with the memory of what happened here 3 years ago. I'm here because sometimes the most terrifying crimes aren't committed by strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes the monster is someone you've shared coffee with, someone whose CB handle you recognize, Someone you've trusted to watch your back on the loneliest stretches of American highway. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the Phantom Fleet, how an entire trucking community was terrorized by someone they considered family. Trucking has always been about more than just moving freight from point A to point B. It's about brotherhood, about drivers looking out for each other in a world where you're often hundreds of miles from the nearest person who gives a damn, whether you live or die. That's what made what happened to the Colorado Corridor drivers so devastating. Someone had taken their trust, their camaraderie, their unwritten code of mutual protection, and twisted it into something monstrous. I first learned about the Phantom Fleet from Marcus Bulldog Harrison, a 60-year-old owner-operator who'd been driving the same route between Denver and Kansas City for nearly 4 decades. Marcus had the weathered face and 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen too much. But when he started telling me about the Phantom trucks, his voice dropped to a whisper that barely carried over the wind. "You got to understand," Marcus said, adjusting his John Deere cap with shaking hands. "We all knew each other on that route. Same trucks, same drivers, same schedule, week after week. When you're out there in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m., those familiar voices on the CB are the only thing keeping you sane." But in the summer of 2020, familiar voices started saying unfamiliar things. Trusted drivers began reporting cargo they weren't supposed to have, taking routes they'd never driven before, and most disturbing of all, asking questions about other drivers, loads and schedules that made everyone uncomfortable. Angela Martinez had been driving trucks for 12 years when she vanished on July 15, 2020. Her route took her from Denver to Wichita every Tuesday and Friday, hauling auto parts for a supply company that had contracted her services for over 3 years. Angela was known among the Colorado Corridor drivers as Nightbird, her CB handle reflecting her preference for driving during overnight hours when traffic was lighter and the roads belonged to truckers. She was also known for her meticulous record-keeping, her punctuality, and her unwavering reliability. That's why when Angela's truck was found abandoned at a rest area outside Limon, Colorado, with her logbook showing impossible entries and her cargo bay empty, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. I spoke with Colorado State Patrol Sergeant Janet Reyes, who was the first responder to Angela's abandoned truck. What she found that morning still haunts her. The truck was running, hazards flashing, driver door wide open. Sergeant Reyes told me, her eyes reflecting the memory of that discovery. But here's what made it strange. Angela's logbook showed she had driven 847 miles in the previous 24 hours, which is impossible. Federal regulations limit drivers to 11 hours of driving in a 14-hour period. Even more disturbing were the CB radio logs retrieved from Angela's truck. The last recorded transmission showed she had been in conversation with someone using the handle Ghost Rider, a driver that other members of the Colorado Corridor community swore didn't exist. The conversation, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., the night before Angela's truck was found, was chilling in its normalcy. Nightbird, Ghost Rider, what's your 20? Ghost Rider, about 15 miles ahead of you. Nightbird, you making good time. Nightbird, roger that. Should hit Limon in about 20 minutes. Ghost Rider, good deal. Hey, I got some information about that load you're hauling. Might be worth your while to hear it. Nightbird, what kind of information? Ghost Rider, the kind that pays better than auto parts. Take the next exit. I'll explain everything. That was Angela Martinez's last recorded communication. She was never seen again. Angela's disappearance sent shockwaves through the Colorado Corridor trucking community. But it was what happened over the next 6 months that transformed concern into terror. Between July 2020 and January 2021, 7 more trucks disappeared along the same 400-mile corridor. Each disappearance followed an identical pattern. The driver would be in CB. Communication with someone calling themselves Ghost Rider, would receive information about supposedly lucrative alternative cargo, would deviate from their planned route. and would vanish without a trace. But here's what made the Phantom Fleet case unique. The trucks themselves weren't just abandoned. They were being used to commit other crimes before being found empty and stripped of identification. Detective Ray Kowalczyk of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation became the lead investigator when the case was elevated to state level. He showed me security footage that made my blood run cold. The footage from a truck stop surveillance camera in Sterling, Colorado, showed Angela Martinez's missing Kenworth T680 pulling into the parking lot 3 weeks after she had disappeared. But the person climbing out of the driver's seat wasn't Angela. It was a man in dark clothing whose face was obscured by shadows and the bill of a baseball cap. We have at least 12 instances of missing trucks being used in subsequent crimes, Detective Kowalczyk explained, spreading photographs across his desk like a macabre card game. Robberies, smuggling operations, even hit-and-run accidents. Someone was using these stolen trucks as phantom vehicles for criminal enterprises. What made the Phantom Fleet investigation so complex was the sophistication of the operation. This wasn't a random truck hijacking. It was a coordinated effort by someone who understood trucking culture, CB radio protocols, and the vulnerabilities of long-haul drivers. The ghostwriter persona was particularly insidious. Analysis of CB radio transmissions showed that ghostwriter had been active on trucker channels for months before the first disappearance, building relationships with drivers, learning their routes and schedules, and establishing credibility within the community. Ghostwriter knew things that only a real trucker would know, Marcus Bulldog Harrison told me. He knew the best truck stops, the locations of way stations, which routes had construction delays. He talked like one of us, but Detective Cole's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Ghostwriter wasn't just one person. Voice analysis of the CB recordings showed at least 3 different individuals using the same handle, suggesting a network of criminals working together to infiltrate the trucking community. The breakthrough came when investigators analyzed the timing and locations of Ghostwriter's CB transmissions. The pattern showed that Ghostwriter was somehow tracking the movements of specific trucks in real time, knew their exact locations, and was intercepting their communications. That meant someone was either monitoring GPS systems or had access to trucking company dispatch information. The investigation took a dark turn when Detective Kowalczyk discovered that all 8 missing drivers had used the same truck stop, Jane Morrison's Travel Centers, as their primary fuel and rest location. Morrison's had 7 locations along the Colorado corridor, and every vanished driver had made their final fuel stop at one of these locations. I spent a week interviewing current and former Morrison's employees, trying to understand how someone might gain access to driver information. What I found was a culture of casual information sharing that made drivers vulnerable to anyone who knew how to exploit it. Truck stop employees routinely had access to driver logs, fuel records, route information, and even personal details about regular customers. Credit card systems tracked purchase patterns, and many drivers shared their schedules openly with staff they considered friends. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ellen Morrison herself, the 67-year-old owner of the truck stop chain. Ellen had noticed something that law enforcement had missed. One of my managers had been asking questions about our computer systems. Ellen told me during our interview at the original Morrison's location. Questions about driver databases, fuel logs, GPS tracking systems. At the time, I thought he was just trying to be more efficient, but looking back, the manager Ellen was referring to was Dale Hutchins, a 41-year-old former trucker who had been hired as night shift supervisor at the Morrison's location in Lemon, the same truck stop where Angela Martinez had made her final fuel purchase. Dale had worked for Morrison's for 18 months, during which time he had access to all driver information, route schedules, and personal details of every trucker who fueled at any Morrison's location. More importantly, Dale had been present during the final visits of all 8 missing drivers. If you're still with us in the darkness tonight, hit that like button and let us know in the comments how this story is affecting you. Because what I discovered about Dale Hutchins will change how you think about trust forever. Dale Hutchins wasn't just a night shift supervisor. He was a former long-haul driver who had lost his commercial driver's license after a DUI conviction. In 2018, his trucking career had ended abruptly, leaving him bitter about an industry he felt had abandoned him. But Dale's intimate knowledge of trucking culture made him the perfect infiltrator. He knew exactly how to talk to drivers, how to build trust over CB radio, and most importantly, how to identify drivers who were most likely to be tempted by offers of easy money. Detective Kowalczyk's investigation revealed that Dale had been using Morrison's computer systems to research driver backgrounds, identifying those with financial difficulties, family problems, or other vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to manipulation. He was like a predator studying his prey. Detective Kowalczyk explained. He knew which drivers were behind on truck payments, which ones had sick family members, which ones were struggling financially. Then he would approach them as ghost rider with offers they couldn't refuse. But Dale wasn't working alone. Surveillance footage from Morrison's truck stops showed him in regular contact with two other men, his brother Carl Hutchins, a former mechanic with a history of auto theft, and Ray Pettigrew, a truck dispatcher who had been fired from 3 different companies for falsifying records. Together, they formed the core of the Phantom Fleet operation. The Phantom Fleet operation was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Dale would use his access to Morrison's systems to identify potential victims, then approach them as Ghost Rider with offers to haul special cargo for significantly more money than their regular loads. The special cargo was always described as time-sensitive and slightly outside normal shipping channels that needed to be moved quickly and discreetly. Dale would offer drivers double or triple their usual rates, with cash payments and no paperwork required. Once a driver agreed to the arrangement, Dale would direct them to an isolated location where Carl and Ray would be waiting. The drivers were told this was where they would pick up their special cargo. Instead, they were met with violence. Detective Kowalczyk's investigation revealed that the missing drivers were likely murdered immediately upon arrival at these remote locations. Their trucks were then driven by Carl or Ray to be used in other criminal enterprises, armed robberies, drug runs, or other crimes where having an untraceable vehicle was valuable. After using the stolen trucks for criminal purposes, the trio would strip them of identification, remove GPS tracking devices, and abandon them in remote locations where they might not be found for weeks or months. The drivers' bodies were never recovered, likely buried in the vast emptiness of eastern Colorado, where thousands of acres of prairie could hide evidence forever. The end came for the Phantom Fleet operation on February 14, 2021, when an undercover Colorado Bureau of Investigation agent posing as a trucker received a Ghost Rider solicitation. Agent Maria Bosques, using the CB handle Desert Rose, had spent months establishing herself as a regular on the Colorado corridor route. She had cultivated a backstory of financial difficulties and family medical bills that made her an attractive target for Ghost Rider's recruitment. When Ghost Rider finally approached Desert Rose with an offer of special cargo worth $15,000 in cash, Agent Vasquez agreed to meet at a remote ranch location 30 miles outside of Limon. Instead of arriving alone, Agent Vasquez was followed by a full tactical team from the CBI and Colorado State Patrol. When Dale Hutchins, Carl Hutchins, and Ray Pettigrew arrived at the meeting location, they were met by law enforcement officers rather than their intended victim. The arrest was swift and decisive. In Dale's possession, officers found detailed files on over 30 Colorado corridor drivers, including photographs, route schedules, and personal information that could only have been obtained through his position at Morrison's. Carl Hutchins was found to have keys and registration documents for 4 of the missing trucks, while Ray Pettigrew had GPS tracking devices that had been removed from victims' vehicles. The trial of the Phantom Fleet Conspirators began in September 2021 and lasted for 6 weeks. The evidence against Dale Hutchins, Carl Hutchins, and Ray Pettigrew was overwhelming. But what made the case particularly disturbing was the revelation of how extensively they had infiltrated the trucking community. Dale's computer contained over 500 driver profiles, suggesting that the 8 confirmed disappearances might have been only the beginning of a much larger operation. Phone records showed communications with individuals in other states, indicating that the Phantom Fleet network might have extended far beyond Colorado. Marcus "Bulldog" Harrison testified during the trial, describing how Dale had approached him multiple times as ghostwriter, with offers of high-paying special cargo runs. Marcus had declined these offers, but he realized that his refusal might have been the only thing that saved his life. Dale knew everything about my route, my schedule, my financial situation, Marcus testified. He knew I was behind on payments for my truck. He knew my wife was in the hospital. He used all of that to try to manipulate me into meeting him at some remote location, where I would have ended up like Angela and the others. The prosecution painted a picture of a methodical operation designed to exploit the trust and mutual support that formed the foundation of trucking culture. Dale Hutchins had taken the very bonds that kept drivers safe on lonely highways and weaponized them for murder and theft. All 3 defendants were convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, theft, and conspiracy. Dale Hutchins received 8 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Carl Hutchins and Ray Pettigrew each received 6 life sentences. But for the families of the missing drivers, the convictions brought little closure. The bodies of Angela Martinez and the 7 other victims were never recovered. Despite extensive searches of the Colorado Prairie, the Phantom Fleet case fundamentally changed trucking culture along the Colorado corridor. The easy trust and open communication that had once characterized the community gave way to suspicion and paranoia. Morrison's travel centers installed new security protocols and restricted employee access to driver information. The company also established a fund to assist families of the missing drivers and hired additional security personnel at all locations. But perhaps the most significant change was in the drivers themselves. Marcus Harrison told me that CB radio chatter along the Colorado corridor became noticeably quieter after the Phantom Fleet arrests. "Nobody wants to talk to strangers anymore," Marcus explained. "You get a call from someone you don't recognize, someone offering you easy money or special deals, and you shut them down immediately. The trust is gone, and it's never coming back." The Colorado Bureau of Investigation established a new protocol for investigating trucker disappearances, recognizing that these cases required specialized knowledge of trucking culture and communication systems. Detective Kalchik became the state's leading expert on crimes targeting the trucking community. The Phantom Fleet case taught us that criminals are specifically studying trucking culture to exploit it, Detective Kowalczyk told me. "They're learning our language, our customs, our vulnerabilities. We have to be equally sophisticated in our response." 3 years after the Phantom Fleet arrests, I drove the Colorado corridor route with several drivers who had known the victims. The highway looked at the same endless stretches of prairie, punctuated by truck stops and rest areas, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where once there had been constant chatter on CB Channel 19, now there were long stretches of silence. Drivers were polite, but guarded when communicating with unfamiliar voices. The easy camaraderie that had once made long-haul trucking feel like membership in an extended family had been replaced by professional courtesy and cautious distance. Ellen Morrison, now 70, decided to sell the truck stop chain after the trial concluded. The new owners kept the Morrisons' name, but implemented strict policies about employee background checks and information security. "I built those truck stops to be a home away from home for drivers," Ellen told me during our final interview. "I wanted them to feel safe, welcome, like they were among family. Dale Hutchins turned that into a hunting ground. He took everything I tried to build and used it to hurt people. The original Morrison's location in Limon, where so many of the Phantom Fleet victims made their final stops, was demolished in 2022. The site now sits empty, marked only by concrete foundations and the memories of drivers who will never return home. Despite the convictions of Dale, Carl, and Ray, significant questions about the Phantom Fleet operation remain unanswered. Phone records and computer files suggested that the three men were in contact with individuals in other states, but these connections were never fully investigated. Detective Kalchek believes that similar operations might be active in other regions where trucking routes are predictable and drivers regularly use the same truck stops and communication channels. Dale Hutchins wasn't a mastermind, Detective Kalchik explained. He was smart, but the sophistication of this operation suggests that someone taught him these methods. Someone with experience in long-term infiltration and manipulation. The CBI has identified at least 12 other trucker disappearances across the western United States that share similarities with the Phantom Fleet cases, drivers who vanished after CB communications with unknown parties, trucks that were later used in other crimes, and connections to specific truck stop chains or service locations. But without the resources for a nationwide investigation, these cases remain open and largely unsolved. On a hill overlooking the former Morrison's location in Lehman, the Colorado Truckers Association erected a memorial to Angela Martinez and the 7 other Phantom Fleet victims. The memorial consists of 8 granite markers arranged in a circle, each bearing the name, photograph, and CB handle of a missing driver. At the center of the circle stands a larger stone with an inscription that reads, "They answered the call of the highway with trust in their hearts. Their brotherhood was betrayed, but their memory endures." I visited the memorial on a cold February morning, exactly 3 years after the arrests that ended the Phantom Fleet operation. The wind across the prairie was bitter, and the sky was the color of old steel. 8 small American flags fluttered from poles beside each marker, and someone had left fresh flowers at Angela Martinez's stone. A note tucked under the flowers. "Read Nightbird, your voice is missed on Channel 19. Keep the shiny side up wherever you are. Your friends at Convoy Express." Standing there among those markers, with the wind carrying the distant sound of truck engines on I-70, I was struck by the profound tragedy of what Dale Hutchins had done. He hadn't just murdered 8 people, he had murdered the trust that held an entire community together. The brotherhood of the road, built over decades of mutual support and shared hardship, had been shattered by someone who understood it well enough to weaponize it. The very thing that made trucking culture beautiful, the willingness to help strangers, to share information, to watch out for fellow drivers, had been turned into a trap. If there's a lesson to be learned from the Phantom Fleet case, it's that predators don't always look like outsiders. Sometimes they look like us, talk like us, and understand our culture well enough to exploit our better instincts. The CB radio handle Ghost Rider wasn't randomly chosen. Dale Hutchins understood that truckers would be drawn to someone who presented themselves as mysterious, but knowledgeable, dangerous, but ultimately trustworthy. He created a persona designed to appeal to drivers who saw themselves as modern-day cowboys navigating the highways of America. Detective Kowalczyk developed a list of warning signs that might indicate when someone on CB radio is attempting to manipulate drivers. Offers of significantly higher pay for special or off-the-books cargo requests for detailed personal information about finances or family situations, attempts to arrange meetings at remote or isolated locations, knowledge of drivers' schedules and routes that seems too detailed, or specific pressure to make immediate decisions about alternative loads or route changes, communications that discourage involving dispatchers or trucking companies. Trust your instincts. Detective Kalchek advises drivers. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The highway can be a dangerous place, but most of the danger comes from people who want to exploit your willingness to trust and help others. Today, as I write this in a truck stop outside Denver, I can hear the subdued conversations of drivers planning their routes, checking weather conditions, and sharing information about fuel prices and road construction. The CB chatter is more cautious now, more professional, less personal than it once was. The drivers I've spoken with understand that the price of their safety is eternal vigilance. They've learned to verify information independently, to be suspicious of unsolicited offers, and to maintain communication with their dispatchers and families when deviating from planned routes. But they've also lost something precious, the sense that every other driver on the highway is a potential friend, that every voice on the CB radio belongs to someone who shares their challenges and understands their struggles. The Phantom Fleet case created a new category of crime, the systematic infiltration and exploitation of occupational subcultures. Dale Hutchins proved that criminals could study specific communities, learn their languages and customs, and use that knowledge to identify and target victims with surgical precision. Law enforcement agencies across the country have taken note. Similar cases, involving the infiltration of other tight-knit professional communities, construction workers, oil field workers, seasonal agricultural workers have been identified and are being investigated with new awareness of these tactics. The most disturbing aspect of the Phantom Fleet case isn't what we know, it's what we don't know. Dale Hutchins had contacts in other states, access to sophisticated information systems, and knowledge of criminal techniques that suggested training or guidance from someone with extensive experience. The investigation that brought down the Phantom Fleet operation in Colorado was successful but limited in scope. Federal agencies have identified similar patterns in other regions, but lacked the resources for comprehensive nationwide investigations. This means that somewhere out there, other Dale Hutchins might be working at truck stops, gas stations, wait stations, or shipping companies, gathering information about drivers and looking for opportunities to exploit their trust. The highway system that connects our communities and commerce continues to serve as both lifeline and hunting ground for every story of drivers helping stranded motorists, sharing fuel in emergencies, or providing assistance during breakdowns. There might be another story of trust betrayed and lives lost. The Phantom Fleet case reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a familiar uniform, speaks in a trusted voice, and knows exactly what to say to make us lower our guard. And sometimes, the person offering to help you make easy money on a special cargo run is actually leading you toward a remote prairie grave that will never be found. As I finish writing this chapter, the CB radio in the truck beside me crackles to life with a transmission from someone calling himself Lone Wolf, offering information about a high-paying load to any driver willing to take a small detour off I-80. The driver he's talking to politely declines and changes channels. In the post-Phantom Fleet world, paranoia isn't a psychological disorder, it's a survival skill. One survivor, a 17-year-old girl, I'll call Maria, not her real name, described being transported in truck trailers over a dozen times during her 8-month captivity. They would drug us before putting us in the trucks, Maria told me through a translator, her voice barely above a whisper. We never knew where we were going or how long the trip would take. Sometimes we would be in there for hours, sometimes for days. People got sick. Some people died. If you're still following us into this darkness, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. What I'm about to tell you about the recruitment tactics used by the Midnight Cargo Network will show you how easily any of us could become victims. The network's success depended on a sophisticated recruitment system that targeted both drivers and victims with scientific precision. For drivers, recruiters focused on individuals facing financial hardship, family medical crises, or other pressures that made them susceptible to offers of easy money. Roberto Sanchez was a perfect example of their target profile. He was supporting a wife and 3 children on a trucker's salary. His youngest daughter required expensive medical treatment, and he had no criminal record that would make him suspicious to law enforcement. The recruiter who approached Roberto, the man calling himself Miguel Santos, had done extensive research on Roberto's background. He knew about Roberto's daughter's medical needs, understood Roberto's financial pressures, and approached him at a moment when Roberto was most vulnerable to temptation. Miguel knew things about my family that he shouldn't have known, Roberto told me during our interview at the Federal Detention Center, where he was being held as a cooperating witness. He knew my daughter's name, knew what hospital she was in, knew how much the surgery was going to cost. It was like he had been watching us for months. The victim recruitment system was even more sinister. The network employed spotters in homeless shelters, bus stations, and other locations where vulnerable individuals gathered. These spotters identified potential victims and provided detailed information about their backgrounds, relationships, and likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. Victims were approached with offers of legitimate work, agricultural jobs, domestic services in other cities. The offers included transportation, housing, and wages that seemed too good to be true. They were. The Midnight Cargo Network had perfected a transportation system that allowed them to move hundreds of victims across international borders without detection. They accomplished this by exploiting weaknesses in the legitimate trucking industry and taking advantage of the massive volume of commercial traffic that crosses the U.S.-Mexico border daily. The network maintained relationships with over 20 trucking companies in California, Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. Most of these companies were legitimate businesses whose owners had no knowledge of how their trucks were being used. Traffickers would approach companies with offers to lease trucks or hire drivers for specific routes, always paying premium rates and providing what appeared to be legitimate shipping contracts. The contracts typically involved moving electronics or automotive parts on routes that avoided major inspection points. Special Agent Rodriguez showed me modified trailers that had been seized during the investigation. The modifications were sophisticated and nearly undetectable during routine inspections. Hidden compartments had been built into cargo areas. Ventilation systems had been installed to keep victims alive during transport, and tracking devices allowed the network to monitor shipments and They were essentially building mobile prisons, Agent Rodriguez explained. The engineering involved was professional-level work. Someone with extensive knowledge of trailer construction and ventilation systems designed these modifications. The most disturbing aspect of the transportation system was its efficiency. The network could move victims from kidnapping to final destination in as little as 48 hours, crossing international borders and traveling hundreds of miles while maintaining the appearance of routine commercial traffic. The Midnight Cargo Network operated a series of safe houses throughout Southern California and Arizona, where victims were held before and after transportation. These facilities were designed to appear as legitimate businesses while serving as prisons for trafficked individuals. FBI raids on these locations revealed the industrial scale of the operation. One facility, disguised as an electronics warehouse in Riverside County, contained holding cells for over 100 people. Another, posing as an agricultural processing facility in Fresno, had dormitory-style accommodations for victims who were being prepared for forced labor assignments. The safe houses were staffed by armed guards who spoke multiple languages and were trained in psychological manipulation, techniques designed to break down victim resistance. Victims were given numbers instead of names, were forbidden from communicating with each other, and were subjected to constant surveillance. Medical facilities were maintained at several locations to treat injuries and illnesses that resulted from the harsh conditions of captivity and transport. However, these facilities were primarily focused on keeping victims alive, and functional, rather than providing genuine healthcare. They treated people like inventory, Agent Rodriguez told me. Victims were cataloged, tracked, and maintained just like any other commodity. The level of dehumanization was complete. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Midnight Cargo investigation was the discovery of who was purchasing trafficked individuals, and for what purposes. The network's client base included agricultural operations throughout California's Central Valley that used forced labor to harvest crops and process agricultural products. These buyers preferred victims who could perform physical labor and were unlikely to escape from remote, rural locations. Manufacturing facilities in Nevada and Arizona that employed trafficked individuals in dangerous or illegal production activities. These clients specifically requested victims with technical skills or education who could perform complex tasks. Domestic service networks that placed victims in wealthy households as unpaid servants, gardeners, and caregivers. These buyers paid premium prices for victims who spoke English and could blend into suburban environments. Sexual exploitation networks that operated massage parlors, escort services, and other businesses throughout the southwestern United States. These buyers specified age, appearance, and other characteristics when placing orders for victims. The financial records seized during the investigation revealed that prices for trafficked individuals ranged from $5,000 for forced labor victims to over $50,000 for victims intended for sexual exploitation or specialized services. Perhaps most horrifyingly, the network maintained a customer service department that handled complaints, arranged exchanges, and provided ongoing support to buyers who were dissatisfied with their purchases. The Midnight Cargo network utilized sophisticated technology to coordinate their operations and evade law enforcement detection. This included encrypted communication systems that allowed coordinators to communicate with drivers, recruiters, and safe-house operators without fear of interception. The network used military-grade encryption and frequently changed communication protocols to stay ahead of law enforcement surveillance, GPS tracking, and route optimization software that allowed the network to monitor shipments in real time, inspection points, and coordinate with receiving facilities. This technology was often more sophisticated than what was used by legitimate trucking companies. Financial systems that used cryptocurrency, offshore banking, and money laundering techniques to hide the movement of millions of dollars in trafficking revenue. The network maintained relationships with corrupt financial institutions in multiple countries. Database management systems that tracked victims, buyers, routes, and financial transactions with corporate-level sophistication. These systems included detailed profiles of victims, buyer preferences, and operational metrics that were used to optimize the network's efficiency. The technology aspect of the investigation required specialized expertise from FBI, cybercrime units, and international cooperation with law enforcement agencies in Mexico and other countries where the network operated servers and communication infrastructure. During my interviews with Roberto Sanchez, I tried to understand how a fundamentally decent man had become complicit in such a horrific operation. Roberto's story illustrates how traffickers exploit economic desperation and parental love to recruit accomplices. Roberto had been making $45,000 per year as a legitimate truck driver, supporting a wife and 3 children in a modest home in East Los Angeles. When his youngest daughter was diagnosed with a rare kidney condition requiring surgery and ongoing treatment, Roberto's insurance covered only a fraction of the medical expenses. The family faced medical bills exceeding $200,000, and Roberto had exhausted his savings, borrowed against his truck, and sought help from every available source. When Miguel Santos approached him with an offer to earn $150,000 over 6 months for special transportation work, Roberto felt he had no choice. I told myself it was just electronics, Roberto explained, tears streaming down his face. I knew It was probably avoiding some taxes or import duties, but I thought that wasn't really hurting anyone. I thought I was just helping my daughter. Case 3. The midnight cargo. The smell of diesel fuel and fear still clings to my clothes as I stand in the evidence warehouse of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, staring at the contents of trailer number 4427B. Rows of wooden crates stretch into the darkness, each one marked with shipping labels that told lies about their contents. Inside those crates wasn't the electronics equipment listed on the manifest. What investigators found was far more valuable, far more dangerous, and far more tragic than anyone could have imagined when they first pulled over the Freightliner Cascadia on that foggy October night in 2021. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the midnight cargo and how one routine traffic stop exposed a human trafficking network that spanned 3 countries and destroyed hundreds of lives. This is the story of drivers who thought they were hauling freight, but were actually transporting the most precious cargo of all, human souls. California Highway Patrol Officer Jennifer Chen had been working the graveyard shift on Interstate 10 for 6 years when she noticed the Freightliner weaving slightly between lanes at 2:47 a.m. On October 15, 2021. The truck wasn't speeding, wasn't violating any obvious traffic laws, but something about its movement pattern triggered her instincts. Officer Chen later told me that it wasn't any single thing that made her decide to initiate the stop. It was a combination of subtle indicators that her training had taught her to recognize the truck was traveling at exactly the speed limit, which was unusual for freight haulers trying to make time. The driver had maintained a consistent distance from other vehicles, suggesting hyper-awareness rather than normal highway driving. Most tellingly, the truck had taken an unusual route, using surface streets to bypass 2 way stations. In my experience, Officer Chen explained, drivers who are trying that hard to appear normal usually have something to hide. The traffic stop began routinely. Officer Chen activated her emergency lights, and the Freightliner pulled over immediately at the designated truck parking area near the Cabazon exit. The driver, a 34-year-old man named Roberto Sanchez, provided his commercial driver's license, registration, and logbook without hesitation. Everything appeared to be in order. Roberto's papers were legitimate. His logbook showed compliance with federal driving hour regulations, and his manifest indicated he was hauling computer components from a warehouse in Tijuana to a distribution center in Phoenix. But Officer Chen noticed something that changed everything. Roberto's hands were shaking, and he kept glancing nervously toward his trailer. "Sir, I'm going to need to take a look at your cargo," Officer Chen informed Roberto. That's when Roberto Sanchez broke down completely. Roberto didn't try to run. He didn't argue or demand a warrant. Instead, he sat down on the truck's running board and began to sob with the kind of desperate grief that comes from a soul pushed beyond its breaking point. "I didn't know," Roberto kept repeating through his tears. "I swear to God, I didn't know what was in there until it was too late." Officer Chen called for backup, while Roberto's confession poured out in a mixture of English and Spanish. A torrent of guilt and terror that revealed the horrifying truth about his cargo. Roberto had been driving trucks for 8 years, making regular runs between Southern California and Arizona. 3 months earlier, he had been approached by a man calling himself Miguel Santos, who offered Roberto significantly higher pay to haul special shipments that required discretion and speed. He said it was electronics that needed to avoid certain import taxes, Roberto explained to Officer Chen. He said the paperwork was complicated, but everything was legal. "He paid me 3 times my normal rate, and my daughter needed surgery. I needed that money." The special shipments always followed the same pattern. Roberto would pick up a preloaded trailer at a warehouse in Tijuana, drive it to various locations in California, Arizona, or Nevada, and drop it off without ever opening the cargo doors. He was explicitly instructed never to inspect the contents and to avoid weigh stations and inspection points. For 3 months, Roberto had made these runs without incident. The money was good, The work was steady, and he convinced himself that he was simply hauling expensive electronics through unofficial channels. But on the night Officer Chen stopped him, something had gone wrong with the trailer's refrigeration unit. When Officer Chen opened the rear doors of Roberto's trailer, the smell hit her first mixture of human waste, fear, and desperation that she later said was unlike anything she had ever encountered. Emergency floodlights revealed a cargo bay that had been converted into a mobile prison. 23. People were crammed into a space designed for freight. They ranged in age from 14 to 55, and they had been traveling in complete darkness for over 18 hours. The trailer's refrigeration system had been modified to provide air circulation, but the unit had malfunctioned during the journey, leaving the occupants in stifling heat without adequate ventilation. Most of the victims were conscious but severely dehydrated and suffering from heat exhaustion. 3 were unconscious and required immediate medical attention. All showed signs of prolonged captivity and abuse that extended far beyond their current journey. Officer Chen immediately called for paramedics, additional patrol units, and agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. As EMTs worked to stabilize the victims, a horrifying picture began to emerge of a human trafficking operation that used legitimate trucking companies as cover for transporting kidnapped individuals across international borders. The victims, investigators learned, were not illegal immigrants seeking passage into the United States. They were kidnapping victims from both sides of the border, American citizens who had disappeared from cities like San Diego and Los Angeles, and Mexican nationals who had been abducted from their homes and forced into slavery. The investigation that followed Roberto's arrest uncovered a human trafficking network of unprecedented scope and sophistication, led by a joint task force including the FBI, DICE, and Mexican federal authorities. The investigation revealed that the midnight cargo operation had been running for over 4 years. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez of the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force became the lead investigator on the case. She showed me evidence that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. Shipping manifests that listed human beings as electronics equipment, GPS tracking data showing regular routes between known trafficking locations, and financial records indicating that the network had generated over $50 million in revenue from the sale of kidnapped individuals. This wasn't a criminal organization, it was a multinational corporation built on human misery, Agent Rodriguez told me. They had HR departments, accounting systems, quality control procedures. They approached human trafficking like any other business enterprise. The network operated through a series of legitimate trucking companies on both sides of the border. Drivers like Roberto were recruited specifically because they had clean records, legitimate commercial licenses, and financial pressures that made them vulnerable to recruitment. Most drivers genuinely believed they were hauling electronics, auto parts, or other manufactured goods. The traffickers went to extraordinary lengths to maintain this illusion, providing authentic-looking shipping documents, legitimate business addresses, and cargo manifests that would pass routine inspections. But a small number of drivers knew exactly what they were transporting and were paid significantly more for their complicity. The 23 people rescued from Roberto's trailer represented only a tiny fraction of the Midnight Cargo Network's victims. FBI estimates suggest that over 400 individuals were trafficked through this operation over its 4-year lifespan. The victims fell into several categories that revealed the systematic nature of the enterprise. American runaways and homeless individuals were kidnapped from cities throughout Southern California and forced into various forms of slavery. These victims were specifically targeted because their disappearances were less likely to generate immediate law enforcement response. Mexican agricultural workers were abducted from rural communities and transported to forced labor camps in California, Arizona, and Nevada. These victims were chosen because they had limited family resources to search for them and faced language barriers that made escape difficult. Women and girls from both countries were trafficked specifically for sexual exploitation, moved regularly between cities to prevent them from establishing relationships with potential rescuers. Children were trafficked for multiple purposes, including forced labor, sexual exploitation, and illegal adoption networks that sold them to buyers throughout the United States. I interviewed several survivors of the Midnight Cargo Network, and their testimonies revealed the calculated cruelty of the operation. Victims were deliberately kept in ignorance about their locations, moved frequently to prevent escape attempts, and subjected to psychological conditioning designed to make them dependent on their captors. Roberto's first few runs went smoothly. He picked up sealed trailers in Tijuana, drove them to locations in California and Arizona, and dropped them off without incident. The money was exactly as promised, and Roberto began to hope that his daughter's medical bills might actually be manageable. But gradually, Roberto began to notice things that made him uncomfortable. The pickup and delivery locations were in isolated areas rather than commercial districts. The trailers were sometimes equipped with unusual ventilation systems. Most disturbing, Roberto occasionally heard sounds from inside the trailers that he couldn't explain. I started to suspect something was wrong, Roberto admitted, but by then, I had already taken so much money. I was afraid that if I stopped or asked questions, they would want the money back, and my daughter would die waiting for treatment. Roberto's moral dilemma illustrates how traffickers create situations where decent people become trapped in criminal enterprises through a combination of financial pressure, gradual escalation, and fear of consequences. Roberto's involvement in the Midnight Cargo Network came to an end because of a mechanical failure that he couldn't have predicted or prevented. On the night Officer Chen stopped him, the trailer's refrigeration unit had malfunctioned, creating a life-threatening situation for the 23 victims trapped inside. As temperatures inside the trailer rose above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, victims began suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Roberto could hear their distress through the trailer walls, and he realized for the first time that he was transporting human beings rather than electronics. I could hear people crying, people calling for help, Roberto told me. I knew I had to do something, but I was terrified. I didn't know how many people were in there or what condition they were in. I didn't know if opening the trailer would save them or get them killed. Roberto was driving toward a scheduled delivery location when he began to seriously consider opening the trailer himself. He was still debating what to do when Officer Ch patrol car appeared behind him with emergency lights activated. When I saw those police lights, I felt relief and terror at the same time, Roberto recalled. I knew my life was over, but I also knew that the people in the trailer might finally be safe. Roberto's cooperation with investigators proved crucial to dismantling the Midnight Cargo Network. His detailed knowledge of pickup and delivery procedures, his ability to identify recruiters and coordinators, and his willingness to participate in undercover operations led to the arrests of over 60 individuals involved in the trafficking network. The investigation into the Midnight Cargo Network culminated in coordinated raids across 4 states and 2 countries. On March 15, 2022, over 400 federal agents, state police officers, and Mexican federal authorities participated in simultaneous operations designed to dismantle the entire network before its leadership could escape or destroy evidence. The largest raid occurred at the network's primary coordination center in Chula Vista, California, disguised as an import-export business specializing in electronics. FBI agents seized servers containing detailed records of over 400 victims, financial records showing transactions exceeding $50 million, and communication equipment used to coordinate trafficking operations. At the same time, agents raided safe houses in Riverside, Fresno, Phoenix, and Las Vegas, rescuing 47 victims who were being held in preparation for transport or final sale. The conditions at these facilities shocked even experienced Investigators who had worked human trafficking cases for years, Agent Rodriguez described one facility where victims were kept in windowless rooms, with no furniture except mattresses on concrete floors. Surveillance cameras monitored the victims constantly, and armed guards prevented any communication between prisoners. The level of psychological control was incredible, Agent Rodriguez told me. Victims had been conditioned to believe that escape was impossible, that their families had abandoned them, and that cooperation with their captors was their only hope for survival. Mexican federal authorities conducted simultaneous raids on facilities in Tijuana, Mexicali, and Guadalajara, rescuing additional victims and arresting coordinators who managed the network's operations south of the border. The prosecution of Midnight Cargo Network members represented one of the largest human trafficking cases in U.S. history. Federal prosecutors charged 73 individuals with crimes, ranging from kidnapping and human trafficking to money laundering and racketeering. The network's leader, a 45-year-old businessman named Eduardo Vargas, had operated legitimate businesses as cover while building a criminal empire based on human suffering. Vargas owned trucking companies, import-export businesses, and real estate developments that provided infrastructure for trafficking operations. During Vargas's trial, prosecutors presented evidence that he had personally overseen the trafficking of over 400 individuals and had generated profits exceeding $50 million over 4 years. Victim testimony revealed that Vargas had been directly involved in recruitment, transportation, and sale of trafficked individuals. The most powerful testimony came from Maria, the teenage survivor I interviewed earlier, speaking through a translator. Maria described how Vargas had personally selected her from a group of victims and had specified the conditions of her captivity and exploitation. "He looked at us like we were animals at a market," Maria testified. "He checked our teeth, our hands, asked us questions about our families. He decided who would go where and for what purpose. He knew that what he was doing was evil, and he didn't care." Vargas was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. His conviction was followed by guilty verdicts for 58 other network members, with sentences ranging from 10 years to life imprisonment. Roberto Sanchez pled guilty to conspiracy charges and received a sentence of 5 years in federal prison, followed by supervised probation. His cooperation with investigators and his lack of knowledge about the nature of his cargo were considered mitigating factors during sentencing. The dismantling of the Midnight Cargo Network freed 117 direct victims and prevented the trafficking of hundreds of others who had been identified as potential targets. However, the investigation also revealed the massive scope of human trafficking operations throughout North America. FBI estimates suggest that the Midnight Cargo Network was only one of several similar operations using the trucking industry to transport victims across international borders. The success of this investigation led to increased scrutiny of commercial transportation systems and enhanced cooperation between American and Mexican law enforcement agencies. New protocols were established for inspecting commercial vehicles at border crossings, with particular attention to trailers that had been modified for human transport. Training programs were developed to help truck drivers recognize signs of human trafficking and report suspicious activities. The trucking industry itself implemented new security measures designed to prevent traffickers from infiltrating legitimate businesses. Background checks were enhanced for drivers and logistics personnel, and companies began conducting more thorough inspections of leased vehicles and subcontracted services. However, law enforcement officials acknowledged that the fundamental vulnerabilities that made the Midnight Cargo Network possible still exist. The massive volume of commercial traffic crossing international borders makes comprehensive inspection impossible, and traffickers continue to develop new methods for exploiting legitimate transportation systems. The 117 victims rescued during the Midnight Cargo investigation faced a long and difficult path to recovery. Many had been held captive for months or years. subjected to physical and psychological abuse that left lasting trauma. Specialized victim services programs were established to provide medical care, psychological counseling, legal assistance, and job training for survivors. However, the complexity of their cases, many involving international custody issues, immigration status questions, and ongoing safety concerns, made recovery particularly challenging. Maria, the teenage survivor I interviewed, spent over a year in protective custody while authorities worked to locate her family and ensure her safety. She eventually returned to Mexico and enrolled in a vocational training program, but she continues to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and requires ongoing psychological support. "I have nightmares about being back in the trucks," Maria told me during our final interview. "I dream about the darkness, about not being able to breathe, about not knowing where I was going or if I would ever see my family again. The fear never completely goes away." Other survivors faced different challenges. American citizens who had been trafficked often returned to the same circumstances that had made them vulnerable in the first place: homelessness, poverty, family dysfunction, or substance abuse problems. Without comprehensive support services, many remained at risk of re-victimization. The network's forced labor victims faced particular difficulties because many had been held in remote, rural locations where they were completely isolated from potential sources of help. Some had been trafficked for so long that they had difficulty readjusting to life outside captivity. 3 years after the dismantling of the Midnight Cargo Network, human trafficking through commercial transportation systems continues to be a major concern for law enforcement agencies. The success of this investigation led to the discovery of similar networks operating in other regions of the United States and Mexico. Agent Rodriguez, who now leads a federal task force focused on transportation-based trafficking, told me that the methods pioneered by the Midnight Cargo Network have been adopted by other criminal organizations. "We shut down one network, but others learned from their techniques," Agent Rodriguez explained. "They saw what worked: the use of legitimate businesses as cover, the recruitment of drivers with financial pressures, the modification of commercial vehicles for human transport. Those methods are now being used by trafficking networks across the country." The scale of the problem is difficult to quantify because victims are often transported across multiple jurisdictions, making it difficult for law enforcement agencies to identify patterns and coordinate investigations. However, estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people are trafficked through the United States each year, with commercial transportation playing a significant role in these crimes. Recent investigations have identified trafficking networks using rental trucks, private shipping services, and even passenger vehicles modified for human transport. The common element in all these cases is the exploitation of legitimate transportation infrastructure to move victims while avoiding detection. The Midnight Cargo investigation revealed that modern human trafficking operations use sophisticated technology to coordinate their activities and evade law enforcement. This has created an ongoing arms race between traffickers and investigators, with both sides constantly developing new methods and countermeasures. Traffickers have begun using artificial intelligence to optimize routes, avoid inspection points, and identify potential victims through social media analysis. Encrypted communication systems allow them to coordinate complex operations across international borders without fear of interception. Law enforcement agencies have responded by developing advanced surveillance technologies, data analysis systems, and international cooperation protocols designed to identify and track trafficking networks. However, the global nature of these operations and the rapid pace of technological change make this an ongoing challenge. The FBI has established specialized units focused on technology-assisted trafficking and has increased cooperation with private sector partners who can provide expertise in areas like cryptocurrency analysis, social media monitoring, and communications interception. The Midnight Cargo Investigation revealed the massive economic scale of human trafficking operations and their impact on legitimate businesses and communities. The network's $50 million in revenue over 4 years represented only a fraction of the total economic damage caused by their activities. Legitimate trucking companies, whose vehicles were used for trafficking, suffered significant financial losses from impounded equipment, canceled contracts, and regulatory penalties. Several companies were forced out of business despite having no knowledge of how their vehicles were being used. The agricultural and manufacturing businesses that employed forced labor gained unfair competitive advantages over legitimate companies that paid fair wages and followed labor laws. This created market distortions that harmed law-abiding businesses and workers. Communities where trafficking victims were held or exploited experienced increased crime, reduced property values, and the social costs associated with supporting survivors who required extensive services and support. The investigation also revealed the enormous profits available to trafficking networks, which helps explain why these operations continue, despite significant law enforcement efforts and harsh criminal penalties. The Midnight Cargo case prompted significant changes in federal and state laws related to human trafficking and commercial transportation. New legislation increased penalties for trafficking crimes, expanded the definition of trafficking to include various forms of forced labor, and created new requirements for businesses involved in transportation and logistics. The Commercial Transportation Anti-Trafficking Act requires trucking companies to implement enhanced security measures, conduct more thorough background checks on drivers, and report suspicious activities to federal authorities. The legislation also provides funding for training programs designed to help transportation workers identify signs of trafficking. Enhanced penalties were established for businesses that knowingly benefit from forced labor, including buyers who purchase products or services produced by trafficking victims. These penalties include significant fines, exclusion from government contracts, and criminal prosecution of corporate executives. Victim support legislation expanded services available to trafficking survivors, including specialized housing, medical care, legal assistance, and job training programs. This legislation also created new immigration protections for foreign nationals who were trafficked into the United States. The Midnight Cargo investigation provided valuable insights into the methods used by modern trafficking networks and the vulnerabilities they exploit. These lessons have informed law enforcement strategies and prevention efforts throughout North America. Key findings include: economic desperation is a primary vulnerability that traffickers exploit when recruiting both victims and accomplices. Programs that address poverty, provide economic opportunities, and support families in crisis can reduce the pool of potential targets. Legitimate businesses provide essential infrastructure for trafficking operations, often without the knowledge of business owners. Enhanced security measures, background checks, and employee training can help prevent this exploitation. Technology plays an increasingly important role in both trafficking operations and law enforcement responses. Continued investment in technological capabilities is essential for staying ahead of criminal innovation. International cooperation is crucial for dismantling networks that operate across borders. Improved communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies in different countries can significantly enhance investigative effectiveness. Victim identification and support services are inadequate to meet the needs of trafficking survivors. Expanded funding and specialized programs are needed to help victims recover and rebuild their lives. Community awareness and engagement are essential for identifying trafficking operations and supporting prevention efforts. Public education programs can help people recognize signs of trafficking and report suspicious activities. As I finish writing this chapter, I'm sitting in a truck stop outside of Phoenix, watching the endless stream of commercial vehicles that carry America's commerce across our highways. Each truck could be carrying legitimate cargo, or it could be carrying something far more precious and vulnerable. The drivers I see here look like Roberto Sanchez working people trying to make an honest living, support their families, and navigate the economic pressures that define modern life. Any one of them could be approached by someone offering easy money for special shipments that seem too good to be true. And somewhere in the darkness beyond these truck stop lights, people are being held against their will, transported like cargo, from one nightmare to another, waiting for someone to hear their cries for help. The Midnight Cargo Network may have been dismantled, but the forces that created it, poverty, desperation, greed, and the vast, anonymous infrastructure of modern transportation, remain as powerful as ever. Roberto Sanchez is serving his sentence in federal prison, haunted by the knowledge that his desperation to save his daughter led him to participate in the destruction of other families. His story serves as a warning about how good people can become complicit in evil when their circumstances become desperate enough. The 117 victims who were rescued are struggling to rebuild their lives, carrying scars that may never fully heal. Their survival is a testament to human resilience, but their suffering is a reminder of the price paid when we fail to protect the most vulnerable among us. And Eduardo Vargas sits in a supermax prison cell, perhaps planning his next business venture, or perhaps training the next generation of traffickers, who will learn from his methods and develop even more sophisticated ways to turn human beings into commodities. The highway stretches endlessly into the darkness, carrying secrets in every trailer, hiding monsters behind every legitimate bill of lading. Tomorrow, another Roberto Sanchez might be approached with an offer that seems like salvation but leads to damnation. Another group of victims might be loaded into a modified trailer, beginning a journey into hell, disguised as routine commercial transport. The midnight cargo continues to roll down America's highways, hidden in plain sight, protected by our assumptions that commercial trucks carry only legitimate freight. But now you know better. Now you know that sometimes the most valuable cargo travels in the darkness, crying for help that may never come. And sometimes, the difference between salvation and disaster is an observant police officer who notices something slightly wrong with the way a truck is being driven on a foggy October night. Case 4, The Way. Station killer. The concrete beneath my feet is still stained with blood. Even after 3 years of rain, snow, and the endless procession of 18-wheelers that roll through this mandatory inspection point on Interstate 80 in Nebraska. The stains are barely visible, not brown. Shadows that could be mistaken for oil spills or rust, but I know what they really are. I'm standing at the Elm Creek way station at 3 a.m., surrounded by the mechanical symphony of idling diesel engines and the soft conversations of drivers waiting their turn for inspection. This place should feel routine, bureaucratic, safe. Instead, it feels haunted by the memory of 7 murders that turned a symbol of highway safety into a killing ground. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the way station killer and how someone used the trucking industry's own regulatory system to hunt drivers who had no choice but to stop, submit to inspection, and trust that the man with the badge was there to protect them. To understand how the way station killer operated, you need to understand the world of commercial vehicle enforcement. Every commercial truck over 10,000 pounds is required to stop at designated way stations for safety inspections, weight verification, and logbook reviews. It's a system designed to keep dangerous or overloaded vehicles off the road, and it's mandatory, no exceptions. When a trucker approaches a way station, electronic sensors and signs direct them to either bypass the station or pull in for inspection. Once inside, drivers must follow a specific protocol, park in designated areas, remain with their vehicles, provide documentation when requested, and submit to whatever inspection procedures the enforcement officers require. This system creates a perfect hunting ground for a predator who understands that drivers have no choice but to comply with official instructions, even when those instructions come from someone who shouldn't be wearing a badge. The Elm Creek way station sits on a desolate stretch of I-80, about 40 miles west of Grand Island, Nebraska. It's staffed by Nebraska State Patrol officers who specialize in commercial vehicle enforcement, and it processes approximately 300 trucks per day during peak hours. But during the overnight shift, when traffic is lighter and supervision is minimal, the weigh station becomes an isolated outpost where a single officer might encounter dozens of vulnerable drivers with no witnesses around for miles. Marcus Thompson was making a routine run from Denver to Chicago when he was directed into the Elm Creek Way Station at 2:17 a.m. on September 12, 2019. His Peterbilt 389 was carrying a load of furniture well within legal weight limits. His logbook was current, and his inspection record was spotless. What happened next was captured on the weigh station's security cameras, but the footage raises more questions than it answers. The cameras show Marcus pulling into the designated inspection area and shutting down his engine as required. A figure in what appears to be a Nebraska State Patrol uniform approaches the truck and begins what looks like a routine inspection. The conversation between the officer and Marcus appears normal. Both men are calm. There's no indication of conflict or resistance. Then, at 2:34 a.m., the figure in uniform walks back toward the weigh station office, and Marcus Thompson is never seen alive again. His body was discovered 6 hours later by the morning shift supervisor, Nebraska State Patrol Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez. Marcus had been shot once in the back of the head at close range, execution style. His wallet, containing $400 in cash, was untouched. His cargo was intact. His truck keys were still in the ignition. But Marcus's CB radio had been torn from the dashboard. His logbook was missing, and someone had carved a symbol into the metal of his fuel tank, a crude drawing that looked like scales, the symbol of justice. Sergeant Rodriguez had been working commercial vehicle enforcement for 12 years, and she immediately recognized that Marcus Thompson's murder was unlike any crime she'd encountered at a weigh station. Weigh stations are supposed to be safe spaces, Sergeant Rodriguez told me during our interview at the Nebraska State Patrol headquarters. Drivers trust us to protect them, not harm them. What happened to Marcus violated everything our profession represents. The initial investigation focused on the security footage, but it revealed a disturbing problem. The figure in the police uniform couldn't be clearly identified. The cameras showed someone approximately 6 feet tall, wearing what appeared to be genuine Nebraska State Patrol clothing, but the lighting and camera angles made it impossible to see the person's face clearly. More troubling, the weigh station's log showed that no State Patrol officers were scheduled to be on duty at the Elm Creek Station between midnight and 6 a.m. on the night Marcus was killed. The facility was supposed to be closed during those hours, with electronic systems directing trucks to bypass the station, yet someone had overridden the electronic controls, activated the inspection lights, and directed Marcus Thompson to pull in for an inspection that should never have occurred. We realized we were dealing with someone who had detailed knowledge of our procedures and possibly access to our equipment, Sergeant Rodriguez explained. This wasn't a random crime, it was planned by someone who understood exactly how weigh station operations work. Over the next 8 months, 6 more truck drivers were murdered at weigh stations across Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas. Each murder followed an identical pattern. Drivers were directed into closed weigh stations during overnight hours, approached by someone in what appeared to be official law enforcement clothing, and executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head. The victims were Jennifer Walsh, 34, killed at the I-76 weigh station near Big Springs, Nebraska. On November 3, 2019, Jennifer was an owner-operator hauling agricultural equipment from Colorado to Iowa. David Kim, 28, killed at the I-80 weigh station near Council Bluffs, Iowa, on December 15, 2019. David was a company driver transporting electronics from California to Illinois. Robert Big Mike Patterson, 45, killed at the I-70 weigh station near Salina, Kansas. On February 8, 2020, Robert was an independent trucker. carrying automotive parts from Texas to Michigan. Sandra Martinez, 38, killed at the I-35 way station near Emporia, Kansas, on March 22, 2020. Sandra was a team driver with her husband, but he had been sleeping in the sleeper berth when she was killed. Timothy Chen, 31, killed at the I-80 way station near York, Nebraska, on May 6, 2020. Timothy was a new driver making only his third long-haul trip. Angela Rodriguez, 42, killed at the I-76 way station near Ogallala, Nebraska, on June 18, 2020. Angela was a veteran driver with over 15 years of experience. Each murder occurred at a way station that was officially closed, yet electronic systems had been activated to direct drivers inside. Each victim was found with the same symbol carved into their truck's fuel tank. Each crime scene showed evidence of someone with official law enforcement equipment and detailed knowledge of way station procedures. The similarity between the murders prompted the formation of a multi-state task force, including investigators from Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Colorado. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to develop a profile of the killer, while cybercrime specialists investigated how the perpetrator was accessing and controlling way station electronic systems. Special Agent Michael Torres of the FBI became the lead investigator on what was officially designated as the Interstate Commercial Vehicle Homicide Investigation. Agent Torres had spent 8 years investigating crimes targeting transportation workers, but he told me the way station killer case was unlike anything he'd encountered. This perpetrator was using the infrastructure of law enforcement against the very people it was designed to protect, Agent Torres explained. Truck drivers are trained to comply with law enforcement instructions without question. The killer was exploiting that trust and compliance to create perfect victims. The 117 victims who were rescued are struggling to rebuild their lives, carrying scars that may never fully heal. Their survival is a testament to human resilience, but their suffering is a reminder of the price paid when we fail to protect the most vulnerable among us. And Eduardo Vargas sits in a supermax prison cell, perhaps planning his next business venture, or perhaps training the next generation of traffickers, who will learn from his methods and develop even more sophisticated ways to turn human beings into commodities. The highway stretches endlessly into the darkness, carrying secrets in every trailer, hiding monsters behind every legitimate bill of lading. Tomorrow, another Roberto Sanchez might be approached with an offer that seems like salvation but leads to damnation. Another group of victims might be loaded into a modified trailer, beginning a journey into hell disguised as routine commercial transport. The midnight cargo continues to roll down America's highways, hidden in plain sight, protected by our assumptions that commercial trucks carry only legitimate freight. But now you know better. Now you know that sometimes the most valuable cargo travels in the darkness, crying for help that may never come. And sometimes, the difference between salvation and disaster is an observant police officer who notices something slightly wrong with the way a truck is being driven on a foggy October night. Case 4. The Way Station Killer. The concrete beneath my feet is still stained with blood, even after 3 years of rain, snow, and the endless procession of 18-wheelers that roll through this mandatory inspection point on Interstate 80 in Nebraska. The stains are barely visible now, brown shadows that could be mistaken for oil spills or rust, but I know what they really are. I'm standing at the Elm Creek Way Station at 3 a.m., surrounded by the mechanical symphony of idling diesel engines and the soft conversations of drivers waiting their turn for inspection. This place should feel routine, bureaucratic, safe. Instead, it feels haunted by the memory of 7 murders that turned a symbol of highway safety into a killing ground. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the way station killer and how someone used the trucking industry's own regulatory system to hunt drivers who had no choice but to stop, submit to inspection, and trust that the man with the badge was there to protect them. to understand how the way station killer operated. You need to understand the world of commercial vehicle enforcement. Every commercial truck over 10,000 pounds is required to stop at designated way stations for safety inspections, weight verification, and logbook reviews. It's a system designed to keep dangerous or overloaded vehicles off the road, and it's mandatory no exceptions. When a trucker approaches a way station, electronic sensors and signs direct them to either bypass the station or pull in for inspection. Once inside, drivers must follow a specific protocol, park in designated areas, remain with their vehicles, provide documentation when requested, and submit to whatever inspection procedures the enforcement officers require. This system creates a perfect hunting ground for a predator who understands that drivers have no choice but to comply with official instructions, even when those instructions come from someone who shouldn't be wearing a badge. The Elm Creek Way Station sits on a desolate stretch of I-80, about 40 miles west of Grand Island, Nebraska. It's staffed by Nebraska State Patrol officers who specialize in commercial vehicle enforcement, and it processes approximately 300 trucks per day during peak hours. But during the overnight shift, when traffic is lighter and supervision is minimal, the way station becomes an isolated outpost where a single officer might encounter dozens of vulnerable drivers with no witnesses around for miles. Marcus Thompson was making a routine run from Denver to Chicago when he was directed into the Elm Creek Way Station at 2:17 a.m. on September 12, 2019. His Peterbilt 389 was carrying a load of furniture well within legal weight limits. His logbook was current, and his inspection record was spotless. What happened next was captured on the way station's security cameras, but the footage raises more questions than it answers. The cameras show Marcus pulling into the designated inspection area and shutting down his engine as required. A figure in what appears to be a Nebraska State Patrol uniform approaches the truck and begins what looks like a routine inspection. The conversation between the officer and Marcus appears normal. Both men are calm. There's no indication of conflict or resistance. Then, at 2:34 a.m., the figure in uniform walks back toward the way station office, and Marcus Thompson is never seen alive again. His body was discovered 6 hours later by the morning shift supervisor, Nebraska State Patrol Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez. Marcus had been shot once in the back of the head at close range, execution style. His wallet, containing $400 in cash, was untouched. His cargo was intact. His truck keys were still in the ignition, but Marcus's CB radio had been torn from the dashboard. His logbook was missing, and someone had carved a symbol into the metal of his fuel tank, a crude drawing that looked like scales, the symbol of justice. Sergeant Rodriguez had been working commercial vehicle enforcement for 12 years, and she immediately recognized that Marcus Thompson's murder was unlike any crime she'd encountered at a way station. Way stations are supposed to be safe spaces, Sergeant Rodriguez told me during our interview at the Nebraska State Patrol headquarters. Drivers trust us to protect them, not harm them. What happened to Marcus violated everything our profession represents. The initial investigation focused on the security footage, but it revealed a disturbing problem. The figure in the police uniform couldn't be clearly identified. The cameras showed someone approximately 6 feet tall, wearing what appeared to be genuine Nebraska State Patrol clothing, but the lighting and camera angles made it impossible to see the person's face clearly. More troubling, the way station's log showed that no State Patrol officers were scheduled to be on duty at the Elm Creek station between midnight and 6 a.m. on the night Marcus was killed. The facility was supposed to be closed during those hours, with electronic systems directing trucks to bypass the station. Yet someone had overridden the electronic controls, activated the inspection lights, and directed Marcus Thompson to pull in for an inspection that should never have occurred. We realized we were dealing with someone who had detailed knowledge of our procedures and possibly access to our equipment, Sergeant Rodriguez explained. This wasn't a random crime, it was planned by someone who understood exactly how way station operations work. Over the next 8 months, 6 more truck drivers were murdered at way stations across Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas. Each murder followed an identical pattern. Drivers were directed into closed way stations during overnight hours, approached by someone in what appeared to be official law enforcement clothing, and executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head. The victims were Jennifer Walsh, 34, killed at the I-76 way station near Big Springs, Nebraska, on November 3, 2019. Jennifer was an owner-operator, hauling agricultural equipment from Colorado to Iowa. David Kim, 28, killed at the I-80 way station near Council Bluffs, Iowa, on December 15, 2019. David was a company driver, transporting electronics from California to Illinois. Robert Big Mike Patterson, 45, killed at the I-70 way station near Salina, Kansas, on February 8, 2020. Robert was an independent trucker, carrying automotive parts from Texas to Michigan. Sandra Martinez, 38, killed at the I-35 way station near Emporia, Kansas. On March 22, 2020, Sandra was a team driver with her husband, but he had been sleeping in the sleeper berth when she was killed. Timothy Chen, 31, killed at the I-80 way station near York, Nebraska, on May 6, 2020. Timothy was a new driver, making only his 3rd long-haul trip. Angela Rodriguez, 42, killed at the I-76 way station near Ogallala, Nebraska, on June 18, 2020. Angela was a veteran driver with over 15 years of experience. Each murder occurred at a way station that was officially closed, yet electronic systems had been activated to direct drivers inside. Each victim was found with the same symbol carved into their truck's fuel tank. Each crime scene showed evidence of someone with official law enforcement equipment and detailed knowledge of way station procedures. The similarity between the murders prompted the formation of a multi-state task force, including investigators from Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Colorado. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to develop a profile of the killer, while cybercrime specialists investigated how the perpetrator was accessing and controlling way station electronic systems. Special Agent Michael Torres of the FBI became the lead investigator on what was officially designated as the Interstate Commercial Vehicle Homicide Investigation. Agent Torres had spent 8 years investigating crimes targeting transportation workers, but he told me the way station killer case was unlike anything. The behavioral profile developed by FBI analysts suggested the killer was likely someone with law enforcement or military background, extensive knowledge of commercial vehicle regulations, and a heat encountered. This perpetrator was using the infrastructure of law enforcement against the very people it was designed to protect. Agent Torres explained, "Truck drivers are trained to comply with law enforcement instructions without question. The killer was exploiting that trust and compliance to create perfect victims." Recent incidents have included fake officers conducting unauthorized searches, criminals using police impersonation to rob drivers, and suspicious individuals hanging around way stations during overnight hours. While none of these incidents have escalated to Mitchell's level of violence, they demonstrate that the threat continues. Driver education programs now emphasize the importance of verifying officer credentials, maintaining communication with dispatchers during enforcement encounters, and trusting their instincts when something seems wrong. However, the fundamental challenge remains. Drivers must balance healthy skepticism with the legal requirement to comply with legitimate law enforcement instructions. The American Trucking Association has developed guidelines for drivers who encounter suspicious law enforcement officers, including procedures for requesting backup verification and safely reporting concerns. These guidelines acknowledge the difficult position drivers face when trying to determine whether an officer is legitimate, while avoiding charges of resisting or failing to comply with lawful orders. Standing here at the Elm Creek Way Station at 3 a.m., watching the endless procession of trucks rolling past on I-80. I'm struck by how normal everything appears. The electronic signs directing drivers to bypass the closed station work perfectly. The security cameras record every vehicle that passes. The memorial to Mitchell's victims is barely visible in the darkness, but I know that somewhere out there, on America's highways, another predator might be studying the patterns of truck drivers, learning their vulnerabilities, and planning to exploit their trust in the very systems designed to protect them. The way station killer may be on death row, but the highways remain hunting grounds for those who understand that truck drivers are often alone, isolated, and required by law to submit to authority figures they have no reason to question. Thomas Mitchell proved that evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it stands in plain sight, wearing a uniform and carrying a badge, waiting for the next victim to comply with instructions that lead to death rather than safety. Every truck that rolls through this way station carries a driver who trusts that the system will protect them, that officers are there to help them, that following the rules will keep them safe. Mitchell shattered that trust for an entire industry, and the scars of his betrayal continue to affect thousands of drivers, who now approach every enforcement encounter with fear instead of confidence. The scales of justice that Mitchell carved into his victims' fuel tanks were his twisted symbol of righteousness, but the real scales of justice are held by judges and juries, not by dismissed cops with grudges and guns. Thomas Mitchell thought he was dispensing justice on America's highways. Instead, he became another monster hiding behind authority, preying on those who trusted him to protect rather than harm. The highway stretches endlessly into the darkness ahead, carrying commerce and dreams, hopes and fears. And somewhere in that darkness, a truck driver is approaching a way station, trusting that the person who will inspect their vehicle and check their credentials is there to help them stay safe on their journey. Most of the time, that trust is justified, but sometimes, as Marcus Thompson and 6 other drivers learned too late, that trust leads to a remote way station, where evil wears a badge and justice comes from the barrel of a gun. Case 5, the final mile. The headlights of my rental car cut through the pre-dawn darkness as I drive the final stretch of Highway 50 through Nevada, the loneliest road in America. It's 4:30 a.m., and I'm following the same route that truck driver Michael Iron Mike Patterson took on his last run 3 months ago, trying to understand how a 25-year veteran of the highway simply vanished without a trace on a road where there's nowhere to hide. This is our final chapter together in this journey through the shadows of America's trucking industry. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the most disturbing case I've encountered, one that remains unsolved, one that suggests the monsters we've explored in previous chapters may be part of something far larger and more terrifying than we imagined. This is the story of the final mile and how the loneliest road in America became the hunting ground for predators who may still be out there, waiting for the next victim to drive into their web. Michael Patterson had driven over 3 million miles in his 25-year trucking career without a single serious incident. Known throughout the industry as Iron Mike for his reliability and endurance, he was the kind of driver that dispatchers called when they needed someone dependable for the most challenging routes. On February 14, 2020, just 9 months ago, Mike left Sacramento with a load of electronics bound for a distribution center outside Denver. His route would take him across Nevada on Highway 50, through some of the most desolate terrain in North America. Highway 50 between Fallon and Ely stretches for 287 miles, without a single traffic light, with only a handful of tiny towns breaking up the endless expanse of desert and mountains. It's a road that tests drivers' endurance and vehicles' reliability, where a breakdown can leave you stranded for hours before another vehicle passes by. Iron Mike had driven Highway 50 hundreds of times over his career. He knew every truck stop, every rest area, every place where a driver could safely pull over in an emergency. His dispatcher's records show he had made this exact run 47 times in the previous 5 years. Always on schedule, always professional. But, on February 14th, Iron Mike's truck was found abandoned at mile marker 184, about halfway between Austin and Eureka, Nevada. The Kenworth W900L was parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing, engine running, and driver's door hanging open, as if Mike had stepped out for a routine inspection and simply vanished into the desert. Nevada Highway Patrol Trooper Sarah Chen was the first officer to respond to the abandoned truck report. What she found at mile marker 184 defied explanation and launched an investigation that would eventually involve federal agencies and uncover connections to unsolved cases across the American West. "I've been working this highway for 8 years," Trooper Chen told me during our interview at the NHP substation in Austin. "I've seen breakdowns, accidents, medical emergencies, every kind of situation you can imagine, but I'd never seen anything like Mike Patterson's truck." The scene appeared normal at first glance. Iron Mike's truck was properly positioned on the shoulder. His cargo was secure, and his logbook showed he was making good time on his scheduled route. His CB radio was tuned to channel 19, and his GPS system showed no deviations from his planned route. But closer inspection revealed disturbing anomalies that suggested this wasn't a routine breakdown or medical emergency. Mike's personal belongings were still in the cab: wallet with $200 cash, cell phone, reading glasses, thermos of coffee that was still warm. His sleeper compartment was undisturbed, with clothes folded neatly and personal items in their usual places. Most significantly, the truck showed no signs of mechanical problems. The engine was running smoothly, all fluids were at proper levels, tires were in good condition, and the electronic systems were functioning normally. There was no reason for Mike to have stopped, yet he was gone, as completely as if he had never existed. The disappearance of Iron Mike Patterson triggered a massive search and rescue operation involving local law enforcement, federal agencies, and volunteer groups. Aircraft searched thousands of square miles of desert, while ground teams combed the area around mile marker 184 for any sign of the missing driver. The most powerful testimony came from Carlos Mendoza, who described the terror of being approached by someone he believed was a legitimate law enforcement officer, only to realize he was facing a killer who had already murdered 7 other drivers. "Thought I was going to die that night," Carlos testified. He looked like a real cop, acted like a real cop, but there was something wrong with his eyes. He enjoyed scaring me, enjoyed having power over me. When the real officers arrested him, I realized how close I came to being his 8th victim. Family members of Mitchell's victims also testified, describing the devastating impact of losing loved ones to someone who had perverted the very system designed to protect them. Sandra Martinez's husband, who had been sleeping in their truck when she was murdered, gave particularly emotional testimony. "I trusted that way station to be safe. We all did." Sandra stopped there because she thought she was following the law, doing what she was supposed to do. Instead, she was led into a trap by someone who used our trust against us. Mitchell showed no remorse during the trial, maintaining that his actions were justified and that truck drivers were inherently dangerous criminals who deserved harsh treatment. His lack of empathy and continued threats against trucking industry witnesses ultimately convinced the jury to recommend the death penalty. Mitchell was convicted on all charges and sentenced to death by lethal injection. He remains on death row at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, while his appeals work their way through the courts. The way station killer case prompted significant changes in commercial vehicle enforcement procedures across the United States. New security protocols were established for way station operations, including enhanced background checks for enforcement personnel and improved verification systems for officer credentials. Electronic control systems at way stations were upgraded, with tamper-proof features and remote monitoring capabilities that make it difficult for unauthorized persons to activate inspection signals or override closure protocols. The case also led to increased awareness within the trucking community about the possibility of encountering fake law enforcement officers. Driver education programs now include training on how to verify officer credentials and what to do if they suspect they're dealing with an imposter. However, the psychological impact of Mitchell's crimes continues to affect truck drivers throughout the region. Many drivers report feeling anxious when directed into weigh stations, particularly during overnight hours when supervision is minimal. Sergeant Rodriguez, who discovered Marcus Thompson's body and led much of the investigation, told me that the case fundamentally changed how she approaches her job. Every interaction I have with a driver now, I'm aware that they might be wondering if I'm legitimate or if I'm another Thomas Mitchell. I have to work harder to build trust because one man destroyed so much of it. One positive outcome of the weigh station killer investigation was the development of improved technology for verifying law enforcement credentials and monitoring weigh station activities. The Department of Transportation worked with technology companies to create systems that make it much more difficult for unauthorized persons to impersonate enforcement officers. New digital credential systems use biometric verification and real-time database checks to confirm officer identities. Drivers can now use smartphone apps to verify that officers they encounter are legitimate and on duty at their claimed locations. Weigh stations have been equipped with enhanced surveillance systems that provide better coverage of inspection areas and automatically alert supervisors when facilities are accessed outside normal operating hours. These systems include facial recognition, technology that can identify known threats and alert law enforcement. Communication systems have been upgraded to provide direct links between drivers and dispatch centers, allowing truckers to report suspicious encounters and verify the legitimacy of enforcement actions in real time. However, technology experts acknowledge that determined criminals can still find ways to exploit these systems, and the fundamental vulnerability of isolated truck drivers encountering law enforcement officers remains a concern. FBI behavioral analysts used the Mitchell case to refine their understanding of criminals who target specific occupational groups. The profile they developed has been used in other investigations involving predators who exploit professional trust relationships. Key characteristics of the occupational predator profile include professional knowledge. Offenders typically have detailed knowledge of their target professions, procedures, vulnerabilities, and trust relationships. Authority exploitation. Criminals use symbols of legitimate authority, uniforms, badges, credentials to create compliance and disable victims. Natural defenses. Systematic approach. These crimes are typically well planned, with extensive surveillance and preparation, rather than random, opportunistic attacks. Ideological justification. Offenders often develop elaborate justifications for their crimes, seeing themselves as correcting perceived injustices or serving a higher purpose. Escalation pattern. The crimes typically escalate from harassment or fraud to violence as the offender becomes more confident and committed to their mission. This profile has been used to identify and investigate similar cases involving criminals who target healthcare workers, construction workers, and other occupational groups that rely on trust, relationships, and standardized procedures. While Thomas Mitchell was clearly responsible for the 7 weigh station murders, investigators believe his case may be connected to other unsolved crimes, targeting truck drivers across the Midwest. Agent Torres showed me files on over 30 suspicious incidents involving fake law enforcement officers who conducted unauthorized stops of commercial vehicles between 2017 and 2020. Many of these incidents occurred in areas where Mitchell was known to operate, but the scope suggests he may have had accomplices or imitators. Mitchell was definitely our guy for the murders, Agent Torres explained. But the fraudulent citation scheme was bigger than what one person could handle alone. We think there were others involved, possibly other dismissed law enforcement officers, or people with similar backgrounds and motivations. The investigation into Mitchell's associates is ongoing, with particular focus on online communities where dismissed law enforcement officers share grievances and discuss vigilante justice concepts. These communities have been identified as potential recruiting grounds for individuals who might be inspired to follow Mitchell's example. The Nebraska Truckers Association erected a memorial at the Elm Creek Way Station to honor the 7 drivers killed by Thomas Mitchell and to remind the industry of the importance of vigilance and protecting themselves from those who would exploit their trust. The memorial consists of 7 granite markers arranged in a semicircle, each bearing the name and photograph of a victim. At the center stands a larger stone with an inscription reading, "They stopped because they trusted. They died because someone betrayed that trust. Their memory demands we remain vigilant." I visited the memorial on the 3rd anniversary of Marcus Thompson's death, joining dozens of truck drivers who had gathered for a remembrance ceremony. The drivers shared stories about encounters with suspicious officers and discussed strategies for staying safe while complying with legitimate law enforcement requirements. One driver, an older man who had known several of Mitchell's victims, told the gathered crowd, "We can't let fear stop us from doing our jobs, but we can't be naive either. Evil sometimes wears a badge, and it's up to us to stay alert and look out for each other." The Lessons the Way Station Killer case offers several important lessons about vulnerability, trust, and the exploitation of authority in occupational settings. Systematic vulnerabilities. Every profession has procedures and trust relationships that can be exploited by predators who understand those systems. Regular security assessments can help identify and address these vulnerabilities. Authority verification. The ease with which Mitchell obtained fake credentials and equipment highlights weaknesses in identity verification systems that extend far beyond law enforcement. Better technology and procedures are needed to prevent impersonation. Isolation. Dangers. The victims were all alone when they encountered Mitchell, with no witnesses or immediate backup available. Occupations that require workers to operate in isolation need enhanced safety protocols. Psychological preparation. Training programs should include education about the possibility of encountering authority figures with malicious intent, while maintaining respect for legitimate law enforcement. Community vigilance. The trucking community's informal communication networks proved valuable in identifying patterns and supporting the investigation. Professional communities should maintain awareness of threats targeting their members. Law enforcement agencies acknowledge that the vulnerabilities Mitchell exploited still exist. Despite improved security measures and awareness programs, the vast network of way stations, truck stops, and enforcement checkpoints across American highways creates numerous opportunities for predators to target isolated truck drivers. The search revealed something that chilled everyone involved. This wasn't the first time a truck driver had vanished on this stretch of Highway 50. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who was assigned to coordinate the federal response, discovered that 5 other commercial drivers had disappeared on Highway 50 over the past 7 years. All had been experienced drivers with clean records. All had vanished during overnight hours on the same 50-mile stretch of highway between Austin and Eureka. All had left behind trucks that showed no signs of mechanical problems or struggle. We realized we weren't dealing with isolated incidents, Agent Walsh told me. We had a predator operating on one of the most isolated highways in America. Someone who had been systematically targeting truck drivers for years. The previous disappearances had been investigated by local authorities as individual cases assumed to be drivers who had walked away from their trucks due to personal problems, medical emergencies, or other circumstances. But when viewed as a pattern, they revealed something far more sinister. Agent Walsh shared the files on the 5 previous disappearances with me, and the similarities were impossible to ignore. Robert Chen, age 34, disappeared July 2017. His truck was found at mile marker 171, with engine running and personal belongings intact. Robert was hauling computer equipment from California to Colorado and had no history of personal problems that would explain voluntary disappearance. Maria Santos, age 41, disappeared October 2018. Her truck was discovered at mile marker 192 during early morning hours. Maria was an owner-operator with an impeccable safety record and a family she was devoted to supporting. She would never have abandoned her truck voluntarily. David Thompson, age 29, disappeared March 2019. His truck was found at mile marker 176 with hazard lights flashing. David was a new driver, making only his 6th long-haul trip, but he had been enthusiastic about his trucking career and had no reason to abandon his vehicle. Jennifer Kim, age 36, disappeared August 2021. Her truck was located at mile marker 188, with cargo intact and no signs of struggle. Jennifer was a veteran driver with 12 years of experience who was known for her caution and professionalism. Carlos Rodriguez, age 43, disappeared November 2022. His truck was discovered at mile marker 179 in perfect mechanical condition. Carlos was supporting 3 children and would never have voluntarily disappeared, leaving his family without income. Each disappearance had occurred during overnight hours, when traffic was minimal. Each victim had been driving alone. Each truck had been found in perfect condition, with no explanation for why the driver had stopped, and each case had gone unsolved, filed away as a missing person report with no active investigation. If you've stayed with us through all these dark highways tonight, leave a comment with the word survivor, so we know you made it to the final mile with us. Because what I discovered about these disappearances connects them to every case we've explored in this series. Agent Walsh's investigation revealed that the Highway 50 disappearances weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a network of similar cases across the American West. The same pattern of overnight disappearances, abandoned trucks in perfect condition, and experienced drivers vanishing without a trace had been reported on isolated highways in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. The total number of missing drivers fitting this pattern was staggering. 47 confirmed disappearances over the past decade, all on remote highway stretches, all during overnight hours, all involving trucks left in perfect condition, with no explanation for the driver's absence. We're looking at what may be the largest SCRIAL predator operation in American history, Agent Walsh explained. Someone or some group has been systematically targeting truck drivers across the western United States, using the isolation of our highway system to make people disappear. Even more disturbing was the discovery that several of the missing drivers had been in CB radio contact with unknown parties just before their disappearances. The communications, recorded by other drivers or monitoring stations, showed conversations with people claiming to be fellow truckers, offering assistance or information. The pattern was identical to what we saw with the Highway Angel case predators, using CB radio to establish trust with drivers, then luring them into traps at remote locations. The FBI's cybercrime unit analysis of the Highway 50 cases revealed sophisticated technological capabilities that suggested this wasn't the work of opportunistic criminals, but rather an organized operation with significant resources. GPS tracking data from the missing trucks showed that all 6 vehicles had experienced simultaneous failures of their satellite communication systems just before the drivers disappeared. The failures appeared to be the result of jamming or interference rather than mechanical problems. Cell phone records showed that all 6 drivers had lost cellular service in areas where coverage should have been available. Again, this suggested deliberate interference rather than natural dead zones. Most significantly, Analysis of the truck's electronic control modules revealed that all 6 vehicles had been accessed by unauthorized diagnostic equipment shortly before the disappearances. Someone with advanced technical knowledge had connected to the truck's computer systems and potentially gained control of various vehicle functions. We're dealing with someone who has professional-level expertise in commercial vehicle electronics, Agent Walsh told me. They can disable GPS tracking, jam communications, and possibly even take control of vehicle systems remotely. This isn't some desert drifter picking off random drivers. This is a sophisticated operation. 3 months into the investigation, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: satellite imagery analysis by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which had been enlisted to search for signs of the missing drivers. Advanced satellite cameras capable of detecting ground disturbances revealed several areas near the highway. 50 disappearance sites where the earth had been disturbed in patterns consistent with grave excavation. The sites were in remote desert locations, miles from the highway, accessible only by 4-wheel drive vehicles. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of buried objects at 3 of the sites. FBI forensics teams began excavation at the first location in September 2024. Just 2 months ago, what they found confirmed everyone's worst fears: the remains of Maria Santos, who had disappeared in October 2018. The forensic evidence showed she had been murdered shortly after her disappearance, then buried in a carefully concealed grave that might never have been found without satellite technology. 2 more excavations revealed the remains of David Thompson and Jennifer Kim. All 3 victims showed evidence of having been killed execution style, similar to the methods used by Thomas Mitchell, the way station killer we discussed in Chapter 4. But the graves contained something else that made the investigation take on national importance: personal items belonging to truck drivers who hadn't been reported missing, license certificates, CB radios, and identification documents from drivers across multiple states, suggesting that the Highway 50 operation was only a small part of a much larger network. The evidence found in the desert graves led FBI investigators to a horrifying conclusion. They were dealing with a criminal network that had been systematically targeting and killing truck drivers across the American West for over a decade. The network appeared to operate similarly to the Phantom Fleet and Highway Angel cases we explored in earlier chapters, but on a much larger scale. Different cells or individuals were responsible for different geographical areas, but they shared methods, technology, and possibly victims. Analysis of communication equipment found in the graves revealed connections to the CB radio frequencies used by the Highway Angel network. GPS coordinates matched locations used by the Phantom Fleet operation. Even some of the fake law enforcement credentials were similar to those used by Thomas Mitchell. "We think we're looking at a franchise operation," Agent Walsh explained. "Someone developed these methods for targeting truck drivers, then taught or sold them to criminals in other regions. It's like a how-to manual for hunting truckers." The implications were staggering. If the techniques used on Highway 50 had been shared with criminal networks across the country, the total number of victims could be in the hundreds or even thousands. The investigation into what the FBI now calls the Interstate Predator Network is ongoing, with task forces in 12 states working to identify victims, locate grave sites, and track down the perpetrators. The scale of the operation has required unprecedented cooperation between federal, state, and local agencies. But the perpetrators behind the Highway 50 disappearances remain at large. Despite the technological evidence and the discovery of grave sites, investigators haven't identified the specific individuals responsible for the murders. Surveillance of the Highway 50 corridor has been intensified, with undercover operations designed to catch the predators in the act. But the isolation that makes the highway perfect for criminal activity also makes it difficult for law enforcement to maintain effective surveillance. "We know they're still out there," Agent Walsh told me. "The pattern of disappearances has stopped. Since we began the investigation, but that probably just means they've moved to a different area or changed their methods. Predators like this don't stop, they adapt. As I write this final chapter, I'm haunted by the realization that the cases we've explored in this series, the Highway Angel, the Phantom Fleet, the Midnight Cargo, the Waystation Killer, may all be connected to a larger network that continues to operate across America's highway system. The techniques used in each case show similarities that suggest shared knowledge or training. The use of CB radio to establish trust, the exploitation of trucking culture and regulations, the targeting of isolated drivers, and the sophisticated understanding of vehicle electronics and communication systems. Law enforcement agencies are now reviewing thousands of missing person cases involving truck drivers, looking for patterns that might connect them to the interstate predator network. Preliminary analysis suggests that dozens of additional cases may be linked to the network, but the vastness of America's highway system and the transient nature of the trucking industry make this investigation incredibly difficult. Drivers routinely travel across multiple states, making it hard to track their movements or identify when they've gone missing. The jurisdictional complexities of investigating crimes that span multiple states create additional challenges. Most troubling is the realization that the network may still be active, operating in regions where law enforcement hasn't yet identified the pattern or connected the cases. Based on the patterns identified in the Highway 50 investigation and the previous cases we've explored, law enforcement agencies have developed a list of warning signs that drivers should watch for. Unusual CB radio communications from unfamiliar voices offering assistance, route information, or cargo opportunities, especially during overnight hours. On isolated highways. Electronic system malfunctions affecting GPS, communications, or vehicle diagnostics, particularly when multiple systems fail simultaneously without mechanical cause. Suspicious individuals at truck stops or rest areas who show unusual interest in driver schedules, routes, or personal information. Vehicles following trucks for extended periods on isolated highways, particularly vehicles that maintain consistent distance without passing. Fake emergency situations, such as stranded motorists or accident scenes that appear staged or inconsistent. The FBI and trucking industry organizations have launched awareness campaigns designed to educate drivers about these threats and encourage reporting of suspicious activities. However, the challenge remains balancing caution with the industry's culture of mutual assistance and cooperation. Iron Mike Patterson's disappearance became the catalyst for exposing what may be the largest criminal network targeting truck drivers in American history. His case connected dots that had been scattered across multiple jurisdictions and years, revealing a pattern that might otherwise have remained hidden. The search for Iron Mike led to the discovery of Maria Santos, David Thompson, and Jennifer Kim's remains, providing closure for their families and justice for their murders. But Iron Mike himself remains missing, somewhere in the Nevada desert. His fate unknown. His truck sits in an FBI evidence facility in Las Vegas, a monument to the ongoing mystery. The Kenworth W900L that carried him safely over millions of miles now serves as a reminder that even the most experienced drivers aren't safe from the predators who hunt America's highways. The Mike Patterson Foundation, established by his family, provides support for the families of missing truck drivers and funds research into highway safety and security. The foundation also sponsors awareness programs designed to help drivers recognize and avoid dangerous situations. Mike would want his disappearance to mean something, his wife Susan told me during our interview. If his case helps catch these killers and saves other drivers' lives, then maybe some good can come from this nightmare. I'm writing these final words as the sun rises over the Nevada desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Highway 50 stretches endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt connecting distant cities across one of the most beautiful and unforgiving landscapes in America. This highway has carried millions of travelers safely across the desert over the decades. It's witnessed countless stories of human endurance, of drivers pushing through fatigue and weather to deliver their cargo and reach their destinations. But Highway 50 also remembers darker stories, the terror of drivers who realized too late that they were being hunted, the final moments of people who trusted the wrong voice on the CB radio, the desert graves that hold the remains of those who simply wanted to do their jobs and get home safely to their families. The loneliest road in America has become a symbol of both the freedom and vulnerability that define the trucking industry. It represents the vast distances that separate us, the isolation that makes long-haul trucking both appealing and dangerous, and the thin line between adventure and tragedy that drivers navigate every day. Somewhere in this desert, Iron Mike Patterson's body lies in an unmarked grave, along with the bodies of other drivers whose names we may never know. The predators who put them there are still out there, possibly watching this very highway, possibly planning their next hunt. The interstate predator network that we've glimpsed through these 5 chapters represents something unprecedented in American criminal history, a systematic multi-state operation designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of an entire industry. The Highway Angel used CB radio deception and human trafficking. The Phantom Fleet infiltrated trucking communities and used trust to lure victims. The Midnight Cargo Network turned legitimate businesses into cover for massive human trafficking operations. The Waystation Killer corrupted law enforcement authority to create perfect hunting grounds. And the Highway 50 disappearances showed us how technology can be weaponized to make people vanish without a trace. Each case revealed different methods, but they all exploited the same fundamental vulnerabilities: the isolation of truck drivers, their reliance on trust and mutual assistance, and the vastness of the highway system that makes oversight and protection difficult. The network continues to evolve, adapting to law enforcement countermeasures, developing new technologies, and possibly recruiting new members from the ranks of dismissed law enforcement officers, former military personnel, and others with the skills needed to hunt human prey effectively. Law enforcement agencies are fighting back with enhanced surveillance, improved communication systems, and better coordination between jurisdictions. But they're always playing catch up, responding to crimes that have already been committed rather than preventing them from happening. If you made it this far into the darkness with us tonight, leave a comment with the word shadow so we know you're one of the brave ones who followed us to the end of this journey through America's most dangerous highways. As we conclude this series of criminal nights, I want to leave you with a warning that extends far beyond the trucking industry. The techniques used by the interstate predator network can be adapted to target any group that relies on trust, follows predictable patterns, and operates in isolated environments. Construction workers traveling to remote job sites, agricultural workers moving between seasonal locations, oil field workers in isolated facilities, emergency responders operating in remote areas, military personnel on routine assignments. Any profession that requires people to travel alone through unpopulated areas could become targets for predators who study their patterns and exploit their vulnerabilities. The monsters we've encountered in this series succeeded because they understood their victims better than their victims understood the threats they faced. They studied trucking culture, learned the language, identified the pressure points, and used that knowledge to turn strength into weakness, trust into vulnerability, and routine into tragedy. The highway stretches endlessly ahead, disappearing into the darkness beyond our headlights. Somewhere on that highway tonight, a truck driver is making a routine run, trusting that the voices on the CB radio belong to fellow professionals, believing that the person in the official uniform is there to help, assuming that the stranded motorist by the roadside is genuinely in distress. Most of the time, that trust is justified. Most CB radio conversations are legitimate. Most law enforcement officers are professional and honest. Most people in distress genuinely need help, but sometimes too often that trust is exploited by predators who have learned to look like helpers, sound like friends, and act like protectors while planning murder, kidnapping, or worse. The interstate predator network may be the largest criminal conspiracy targeting a specific industry in American history, but it won't be the last. As our economy becomes more mobile, our communication systems more complex, and our communities more dispersed, new opportunities for predators will emerge. The techniques we've explored: CB radio deception, authority impersonation, technology manipulation, community infiltration will be adapted and refined by new generations of criminals who understand that the most effective hunting grounds are those where prey comes willingly. As I drive through the dawn light on Highway 50, I'm thinking about all the drivers who never made it home. Tommy Kowalski, who stopped to help what he thought was a stranded motorist. Angela Martinez and the 7 other Colorado corridor drivers who trusted someone they thought was part of their community. The 117 victims of the Midnight Cargo Network who were sold like property to buyers who saw them as disposable commodities. Marcus Thompson and the 6 other drivers who complied with what they believed were legitimate law enforcement instructions. Iron Mike Patterson and the 5 other drivers who vanished into the Nevada desert without a trace. Their stories are warnings written in blood on the asphalt of America's highways. They remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears familiar faces, speaks in trusted voices, and uses our better instincts against us. But their stories are also testaments to the courage of the investigators who refused to give up, the family members who demanded justice, and the drivers who continue to risk their lives every day to keep America's economy moving. The highway remembers them all. The victims who died trusting the wrong people, the survivors who escaped to tell their stories, and the heroes who brought killers to justice. Their memories travel these roads like ghosts, warning future travelers about the dangers that hide in plain sight. The sun is fully up now, burning away the shadows that had hidden so many secrets. The Nevada desert stretches in all directions, beautiful and deadly, holding its secrets close. Highway 50 continues its endless journey across the landscape, carrying commerce and dreams, hopes and fears. Somewhere out there, the interstate predator network continues to operate, adapting to new challenges, developing new methods, and hunting new victims. The monsters we've encountered in these 5 chapters may be in prison or dead, but others have taken their place. Learning from their successes and failures, the highway system that connects our communities and powers our economy will always be both lifeline and hunting ground, sanctuary and danger zone. The same isolation that makes long-haul trucking an adventure also makes it a risk. The same trust that holds the trucking community together also makes it vulnerable to those who would exploit that bond. As we end our journey through these criminal nights, remember that the darkness we've explored isn't just history, it's an ongoing reality. Right now, as you read these words, predators are monitoring CB radio channels, studying driver patterns, and planning their next hunt. But also remember that knowledge is power, awareness is protection, and vigilance is survival. The stories we've shared may be frightening, but they're also educational. Understanding how these predators operate is the first step in avoiding their traps. The highway ahead is long and dark, full of dangers we can't always see, but it's also full of good people trying to do honest work. Law enforcement officers genuinely trying to protect and serve, and communities that look out for their own. Drive safe out there. Trust your instincts. Verify before you believe. Help others when you can, but always remember that sometimes the person asking for help is the one you need help escaping from. The highway never sleeps, and neither do the monsters who hunt it. But now you know they're there. Good night, and sweet dreams.